She had pulled 3 people back from the edge of death before the sun came up, and now a man in a cashmere blazer was laughing at her shoes. Nora Callahan sat in Seat 2A of Meridian Airlines. Flight 1147, still wearing the scrubs she'd had on for 19 hours straight. There was dried blood near her left cuff, not hers, and a bruise forming along her collarbone from where a patient had seized and grabbed her during a code. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Her eyes carried the particular flatness of someone who had seen too much in too short a time, and she was trying, very deliberately, to disappear into the leather headrest and sleep for the next 4 hours. That was before the man in 1C decided she was interesting. "Excuse me," his voice was the kind of loud that wasn't accidental. "Did they bump you up from economy, or—" He paused, letting his eyes drag down her scrubs, then back up to her face. "How does someone like you end up in first class?" The cabin went quiet in that way cabins do when people smell blood. Nora opened one eye, closed it again. She didn't answer. That was the first mistake people always made when they met her. They interpreted quiet as invitation. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The man's name was Marcus Hale. Nora didn't know that yet, but she would. He was in his mid-50s, the kind of man who had been rewarded so consistently throughout his life that he'd stopped being able to distinguish between confidence and contempt. He wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars. His wife, seated beside him, smiled at him the way someone smiles when they've long since stopped trying to correct something they can't change. She wasn't cruel, just absent from the whole thing, like she was watching it through a window. "I'm just saying," Marcus continued, louder now, leaning past his wife toward the aisle. "They must be running some kind of promotion. Nurses flying first class." He chuckled. 2 rows back, a young guy in a polo shirt laughed because that's what young guys in polo shirts do when men like Marcus set the tone. Nora shifted in her seat. She pulled her bag from under the seat in front of her, reached inside, and retrieved a small orange prescription bottle, ibuprofen, the civilian kind, because the military-grade stuff she'd gotten used to a long time ago wasn't something she carried anymore. She dry-swallowed 2 pills and tucked the bag back under the seat. That's when her sleeve rode up, just for a second. Just long enough. The tattoo was on the inside of her left forearm. Not decorative, not large, not the kind of thing you'd show off at a bar. An anchor, drawn clean and minimal, wrapped with a chain of exactly 11 links. Below it, in small block letters, Phantom. Marcus didn't see it, but the man in 4B did. He'd been still since boarding. Window seat, dark jacket, the kind of quiet that had edges to it. He looked like he was sleeping, but his eyes had opened the moment Nora walked down the jetway, and they hadn't fully closed since. When her sleeve rose, his entire body went rigid, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone around him, just a single degree of tension, like a wire being pulled taut. His name was Colonel Douglas Farr. He was not on this flight by coincidence. The plane finished boarding and the door sealed shut. The flight attendant moved through the safety demonstration with the energy of someone on their 14th flight of the week, and Marcus Hale had moved on to ordering a double scotch and explaining to his wife, at volume, why the Harland acquisition was going to close regardless of what the board said, because the board didn't understand leverage the way he did. Nora put in her earbuds. No music, just the physical signal. I am not available. It didn't work. "You know," Marcus said, tilting toward her as the plane climbed, "I'm not trying to be rude, I'm just curious. It's a $900 seat. That's 2 weeks of nursing salary, isn't it?" He said it pleasantly. That was the cruelest part. The pleasantness. The total absence of awareness that he was doing anything wrong. Nora pulled one earbud out. She looked at him for the first time. Not long, just enough to take inventory. The watch, the posture, the slight flush of the first scotch, the way he held eye contact like a man who'd never had to look away first. "It was a bereavement fare," she said. "My father." A beat of silence, then, "Oh." Marcus sat back slightly. I'm sorry for your—" "No, you're not," Nora said, and put the earbud back in. The wife looked out the window. The young guy in the polo shirt had gone very quiet. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, and turned back to his drink. For about 40 minutes, that was that. 40 minutes was the length of Nora Callahan's piece on any given day. She had calibrated her life around it. In the field, it had been the average window between engagements. In the trauma unit at Red Haven General, it was about how long a quiet stretch lasted before the radio crackled. She had learned, somewhere between her 23rd birthday and her 27th, that peace was not a destination, but a gap you filled as fast as you could. She used the 40 minutes to half sleep in the way she'd mastered during her deployment years. Body still, brain in a kind of standby mode, aware enough to wake instantly if the air pressure changed or someone nearby made a sound that didn't fit. Her mind kept drifting back to Base 7. The patient had been a 42-year-old man, a construction worker named Terrence, who came in with what the paramedics called a possible cardiac event and turned out to be an aortic dissection, a tear in the wall of the largest artery in the body, the kind of injury that killed people fast if you didn't know exactly what you were looking at and move exactly the right way. The attending on call, a surgeon named Dr. Myers, who was 3 years out of residency and still had that particular combination of intelligence and inexperience that made him dangerous in the best and worst ways, had been leaning toward treating it as a standard M1 until Nora had looked at the blood pressure differential between Terrence's arms and said flatly, "It's a dissection. He needs CT and a cardiothoracic surgeon right now." Myers had hesitated. She didn't let him hesitate for long. She wasn't supposed to override an attending. She knew that. She had the kind of knowing that comes from being told something many times and understanding it intellectually while simultaneously being constitutionally unable to watch someone die when the answer is right in front of you. Terrence went to surgery. He made it. Dr. Myers hadn't said anything to her afterward. Not thank you, not you were right, nothing. He just moved to the next chart. That was fine. She wasn't doing it for thank yous. She was somewhere in this half-memory when Marcus Hale spilled his second scotch. It wasn't deliberate, or maybe it was, she'd never know. But the glass tilted off his tray table and hit the armrest between them, and a significant portion of it landed on her left leg, soaking through her scrub pants and immediately into the bruise on her knee that she'd gotten when Terrence had coded, and she dropped to the floor. "Oh, damn!" Marcus grabbed a cocktail napkin that would be functionally useless. "Sorry about that." Nora went still in a very specific way. It was the kind of stillness that people who'd served with her would have recognized immediately, the kind that came before controlled action. Her hands were flat on her thighs, her jaw was set, her breathing was measured. "It's fine," she said, and her voice was so steady it was almost unsettling. She flagged down the flight attendant, a young woman named Dana who had been watching the Hale situation with quiet professional concern for the past hour, and asked for club soda and paper towels. Dana brought them without being asked twice. Nora cleaned up the mess efficiently and without ceremony, folded the used napkins, and handed them back. "You're very calm," Marcus observed. He meant it as a compliment, or thought he did. It came out condescending, which was more honest. "I'm tired," Nora said. "Long shift?" 19 hours. Marcus whistled. "Well, that's dedication." Another pause. "Why do you do it?" "The nursing. It seems—" He searched for the word thankless. Nora looked at him again. "Someone has to," she said. He laughed. Not cruelly this time, more like he found the simplicity of it charming in the way people find things charming when they've never had to think about them seriously. "That's very noble," he said. "It's not noble," she replied. "It's just the job." There was something in her tone that made him hesitate. Not quite a warning. Something quieter than that. A door closing rather than a fist slamming. Marcus turned back to his drink and left her alone. In 4B, Colonel Douglas Farr had not moved. The seatbelt sign came off somewhere over the Rockies. Nora had actually managed 20 minutes of real sleep when the woman in 3A, mid-30s, headphones, previously invisible, leaned across the aisle and said quietly, "You okay? He's been kind of a jerk." Nora blinked. "I'm good. Thank you." "I'm Petra," the woman said. "Nora. You're a trauma nurse." "Yeah." Petra nodded, looked like she might say something else, then just offered a small smile and put her headphones back on. It was exactly the right amount of human contact. Brief, sincere, no performance. Nora appreciated it more than she would have been able to explain. She reached up and angled the overhead vent toward her face and looked out the window. The clouds below were dense and flat, like a floor. The light was the particular pale gold of late afternoon at altitude, clean and directionless. She thought, not for the first time in recent months, that the air up here was the freest she felt. Above everything, attached to nothing, the whole geometry of her life temporarily suspended. She was thinking about her father. Not about grief, exactly. She'd had 2 years to sit with that, and she'd done the work, or most of it. What she thought about was smaller things. The way he'd taught her to read a compass at age 9, because he didn't trust GPS and said you should always be able to find your own way home. The handshake he used with her. Not a hug. Never a hug. They weren't built that way, neither of them. But a specific grip, thumb over thumb, like a lock clicking. He'd been career military, retired master sergeant. He had never once asked her what she was doing in the years she was in the classified program. He seemed to understand that the question would require an answer she couldn't give. He asked her instead about other things, what she was reading, whether she was sleeping, if she was eating enough. She hadn't been doing any of those things. But she'd told him yes because he needed to hear it. The funeral had been in Billings 3 days ago. The one in Billings that no one would know about. The private one, with just 4 people in a small room before the official service that she'd arranged for his VA friends and old unit buddies. She'd stood in the front row of the official service and shaken hands and said the right things, and felt approximately nothing because she'd done her actual grieving the week before, alone, in a motel room outside of town, with the television on for noise. The first-class seat was an extravagance. The bereavement fare had gotten her halfway there. She'd paid the rest because she needed to sit somewhere with enough space to breathe without someone pressed against her shoulder, and she was too exhausted to manage courtesy. She closed her eyes again. "But I know what that is." The voice was low and close and directly behind her left ear. Nora was awake before the sentence finished. Not startled. She didn't startle, hadn't in years, but suddenly, completely present. Her hands were already moving toward a neutral position, arms slightly tensed, the muscle memory of 100 threat assessments kicking in before her conscious mind had even processed the words. She turned her head slowly. The man from 4B had moved to the empty seat in 3C, the aisle seat, 1 row behind her, close enough to speak without being heard by Marcus Hale or anyone else. He was leaning forward slightly, forearms on his knees, hands visible. He was in his early 60s, gray at the temples, shorter on the sides, a face that had spent time in harsh conditions, not weathered in the worn-out sense, but in the structural sense, as if the elements had carved away anything soft and left only what was load-bearing. He wore a plain dark jacket over a civilian shirt, but he held himself like someone who had spent so many years in uniform that it had become a posture rather than a habit. His eyes were on her arm, on the tattoo. 11 links, he said quietly, anchor and chain, phantom in block letters. He paused. You were an echo unit. Nora's chest tightened by 1 degree. She said nothing. I was the intelligence liaison on Operation Halcyon, he continued. DOD, Defense Intelligence Agency, technically, but that's a long story. He watched her face. I've been looking for the survivors for 11 months. I found 3 names. 2 of them are dead. Nora turned back to face the front of the cabin. Wrong person, she said. Nora Callahan, born in Missoula. Enlisted at 19. Assigned to the 75th Rangers, then moved laterally into a program that doesn't officially appear in any public record. Combat medic certification, Tier 1 clearance, and an operational call sign that, lower your voice, she said. Her own voice was completely flat. He stopped, adjusted. I'm Colonel Douglas Farr. Retired. I have identification if... I don't need your identification. Then you know who I am. A long pause. She was looking at the headrest in front of her, and her hands were in her lap, and her face was doing the thing it always did when she was processing something she didn't want to process. Absolutely nothing. A stillness so complete it looked like patience. What do you want? She finally said. I want to talk, Farr said. That's all. There are things happening at a level above my clearance now, and the people involved need to know that the remaining phantom operatives are— There are no remaining phantom operatives, she said. The unit was dissolved. The unit was erased, he said. That's different. The plane hit a pocket of light turbulence. A drink rattled in Marcus Hale's tray. He swore mildly and grabbed for it. Nora kept her eyes forward. Whatever you think you know about me, she said, you're talking to the wrong person. I know about the 11 beads, Farr said quietly. The air between them changed. 11 beads, steel beads on a cord. One for each member of a unit that had gone into a place they were never supposed to go and done a thing that had never been officially acknowledged, and come back changed in ways that took years to surface, and in some cases never surfaced at all because the people carrying them hadn't come back in one piece. Nora kept her face still, but her hands, in her lap, closed into fists. Marcus Hale chose this moment, with the particular genius of the truly self-involved, to turn in his seat and look at Nora again. You know, he said, with the casual authority of someone who had spent a lifetime filling silences with his own voice, I actually know the CEO of Red Haven General, Gary Birch. Good man. We've done work together. He swirled the last of his scotch. You work there? Red Haven? Nora turned from Farr to Marcus with an expression that contained nothing useful for Marcus to read. Yes, she said. Small world. He tilted his head. You enjoy it? Working there? It's a good hospital, she said. Gary's been making some changes, I hear. Restructuring the nursing staff. Trying to bring in a more, what did he call it? A more streamlined model. Marcus shrugged. I don't know the details. Nora felt something shift, not visibly, not in any way Marcus could see, but a particular kind of attention activated in her. The same attention she brought to a patient whose vitals were slightly off in a way that didn't yet make a pattern, but gave her the feeling that a pattern was coming. What kind of restructuring? She said. Marcus waved a hand. Oh, the usual. Consolidating departments, cutting overhead. I think they're looking at the trauma unit specifically. Gary mentioned something about a younger, fresher approach. He smiled. No offense. None taken, Nora said. She turned back to face front. In the seat behind her, Colonel Farr had gone quiet, watching the exchange with the particular quality of stillness she recognized from debrief rooms. The trauma unit. She had been at Red Haven General for 4 years. She had rebuilt the triage protocol from the ground up after the previous version, killed a patient through delay. She had trained 6 nurses in the past 2 years alone. She had written the mass casualty response plan that the hospital had never needed to use, but that sat in the emergency binder in every department head's office. And a man who'd spilled scotch on her leg knew the hospital's CEO and was talking about fresh approaches and younger staff like those things were synonymous. She thought about Terrence, about Bay 7, about Dr. Myers and his silence, about all the ways that being right and doing right were not the same thing as being protected. The plane had crossed into Central Time when Marcus Hale's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his expression did something complicated, a flicker of satisfaction, then something tighter. He sat up straighter, typed a rapid response. Change of plans, he said to his wife, not quietly. Birch moved the dinner to tonight. We'll go straight from the airport. His wife closed her magazine. Tonight? I thought it was Thursday. It's tonight, it's fine. He was already scrolling through something on his phone, tapping, sending. Nora heard this and filed it without comment. Farr leaned forward again. His voice was barely above a breath. Birch? He said. Gary Birch. You know that name. He runs the hospital where I work, Nora said. He runs the hospital where you work, and he's on the board of a private equity group that's been acquiring regional trauma centers and converting them into high-margin elective surgery facilities. The Halcyon file has his name in it for a reason that has nothing to do with hospitals. A pause. I wasn't on this flight by accident, Nora. She absorbed that. The use of her first name. The way he said it. Not familiar but careful. The way you said the name of something you were trying not to damage. You're going to tell me it's connected, she said. The restructuring at Red Haven. The Halcyon file. Whatever you think is happening. I'm going to tell you that the reason I spent 11 months looking for surviving phantom operatives is because 2 of them died in circumstances that weren't accidental, Farr said. And I'm going to tell you that 3 weeks ago, someone pulled your service record from a federal archive. Not a formal request, an unauthorized access. Nora said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the cloud cover had thinned. The planes were visible now, flat and brown gold stitched with roads. Who accessed it? She said. I'm working on that, Farr said. That's why I needed to find you first. Marcus Hale was laughing at something on his phone. His wife had gone back to her magazine. The flight attendant moved through the cabin collecting cups with the focused efficiency of someone on a deadline. Nora reached up and pressed the button to recline her seat. One notch, no more. You said 2 names are dead, she said. Who was the third? Farr was quiet for a beat. Sergeant Elio Vargas, he said. That bossy, last known location, Reno. I couldn't find him. Nora closed her eyes. Elio Vargas had run comms on Halcyon. He was 24 years old when they went in. He had a scar on his chin from a childhood fall and a habit of folding and refolding the same piece of paper when he was nervous until it fell apart. She had patched him up twice in the field, once from shrapnel, once from something she was never allowed to document. He had been the youngest of them. I know where Vargas is, she said. Farr went very still. He's been in a VA psychiatric facility outside of Carson City for the past 1.5 years, she said. He's not lost. He's just... She stopped, found a different way to finish. He's somewhere safe. He's been contacted, Farr said. Her eyes opened. Someone reached out to Vargas 2 weeks ago, Farr said, posing as a DoD contractor running a benefits review. Asked him questions that were very specific, about Halcyon, about the unit's composition, about you. The plane began its initial descent. The seatbelt sign came on with a soft chime. Marcus Hale put his phone away and stretched with the expansive comfort of a man who expected to be met on the ground by people eager to accommodate him. Nora sat very straight in seat 2A. Her mind was running through it the way it ran through a crisis. Not panicking, not spiraling, but mapping. Inputs, outputs, variables, timelines. Someone had accessed her service record. Someone had questioned Vargas. 2 former unit members were dead, and she was on a plane landing in Billings, which was where Gary Birch was having dinner tonight with the man who had spent the last 2 hours treating her like an inconvenience. I need a name, she said quietly. Whoever accessed the record, whatever you have. I can get you that by morning, Farr said. Tonight. He looked at her. I'll make some calls when we land, he said. She nodded once and turned back to face forward. The descent continued. The planes rose toward them. The city of Halston spread below in the early evening light. Streets and blocks and lights just beginning to come on, ordinary and intricate, the way cities always looked from above before you got close enough to see the damage. Nora Callahan pressed her hands flat against her thighs. 19 hours into a shift, 2 days after burying her father, and somewhere below her, someone was asking questions about her past that they had no right to be asking. She was tired, but she had been tired before. The wheels touched down, and the cabin came alive with the sounds of seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins opening and people reclaiming their ordinary lives. Marcus Hale stood first, naturally, pulling his carry-on with the ease of a man accustomed to priority. He glanced down at Nora, something shifting in his expression. Not exactly apology, but a vague discomfort, the ghost of a thing he probably wouldn't hold on to past the arrivals hall. Safe travels, he said. She looked up at him. You too, she said. He moved past. His wife followed without looking at her. Farr stood and stepped into the aisle, blocking the row behind him, and looked at her once more. Runway B parking lot, he said quietly. Dark blue Jeep. Give me 30 minutes. She held his gaze. 20, she said. He almost smiled. Then he turned and moved toward the front of the plane. Nora stayed seated until the cabin had mostly emptied. She put her bag on her lap. She looked at the tattoo on her forearm, the anchor, the 11 links, the single word in block letters. She pulled her sleeve down. She stood up and walked off the plane, and somewhere in Halston, a name she thought she'd buried was being spoken by the wrong people for reasons she didn't yet fully understand. She intended to fix that. The airport was the kind of small that felt honest. 1 terminal, 2 baggage carousels, a coffee kiosk that closed at 7. Nora moved through it with her bag over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, not looking at anything in particular, but registering everything. The family with the stroller cutting left toward ground transportation, the two men in matching jackets near the far exit who weren't talking to each other but were standing at the same angle. The security camera above Carousel 2 that had a cracked housing and was probably on a maintenance ticket no one had filed yet. Old habits. She'd tried to stop doing it in grocery stores and movie theaters and the waiting rooms of the places she'd taken her father during his last year. She'd never entirely succeeded. Outside, the air was dry and had that particular Billings quality in early fall, cool at the edges, but not yet cold, carrying a faint smell of grass and distance. The parking lot was lit in the flat, efficient way of airport lots, evenly spaced sodium lights that eliminated shadows and made everything look slightly unreal. She found the blue Jeep in 12 minutes. Farr was already there, leaning against the driver's side with his phone to his ear. He held up a finger when he saw her, finished the call in 2 sentences she didn't catch, and pocketed the phone. "You said 20 minutes, she said. "You said 20, I said 30. He unlocked the Jeep. "Get in." She didn't move immediately. She stood on the passenger side and looked at him across the roof of the vehicle, taking the measure of him the way she'd learned to measure people, not by what they said, but by what they did with their hands and their weight and their eyes when they thought no one was evaluating them. Farr's hands were loose at his sides. His weight was centered. He met her eyes without performance. She got in. He pulled out of the lot before either of them spoke again. The highway was mostly clear in the early evening, headlights sparse, the mountains a dark mass to the west against a sky that still held a rim of orange at the horizon. "The name," she said. "I'm working on a confirmation. The access was routed through a federal contractor portal. That's why it took this long to trace. Whoever did it knew the system." "How long for confirmation?" "A few hours, maybe less." He checked the mirror. "Where are you staying?" "I haven't figured that out yet. There's a place on Rimrock Road, small, clean, cash-friendly. I stayed there last night." He handed her a folded piece of paper from the center console. On it was an address and a 4-digit code. Side entrance. Owner doesn't ask questions. Nora took the paper. "You planned this," she said. "I planned for the possibility that you'd cooperate," he said. "The other possibility was that you'd walk away and I'd have to find another way." "I haven't cooperated," she said. "I've listened." "That's the same thing, for someone like you." She looked out the passenger window at the passing dark. "Tell me about the 2 who died," she said. Farr was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. "First one was Marcus Teal," he said. "Comms specialist on Halcyon, secondary role. He left the military in 2019, was working as a security contractor in Denver. He died in February, ruled an accident. He was found at the bottom of a parking garage stairwell." Nora kept her eyes on the window. "Second was Adrienne Costas," Farr said. "Tactical medic, secondary breacher. She'd been living off-grid in Eastern Oregon for 2 years. She died in April. House fire. The investigation closed in 6 weeks. Teal she had known moderately well. Costas she had known well enough that the name landed with a specific weight, a face, a voice, a particular laugh that came out of nowhere and was always slightly too loud for the situation. Costas had been the kind of person who made a place feel warmer without trying. "They were targeted," Nora said. "I believe so. I can't prove it yet." "But you have enough to believe it." "I have enough that I drove to Billings and boarded a flight I didn't need to take," Farr said. "Yes." She finally turned to look at him. His profile in the passing lights was all sharp angles and careful blankness. "What was in the Halcyon file that's worth killing for?" she said. He didn't answer right away. The road curved, and the city lights came up on the right, and he took an exit that headed toward the older part of town, away from the chain hotels and the franchise restaurants. "The mission outcome," he said finally. "The real one. Not what's in the official record. The official record says the mission was a partial success with acceptable losses. The official record was written by people who needed it to say that," Farr said. "The actual outcome, what happened in those last 6 hours, was something else. And there are people who have spent the past several years trying to make certain that version of events never becomes attributable, because if it does, it doesn't just end careers." He paused. "It ends institutions." Nora processed that. She knew, of course, what had happened in the last 6 hours of Halcyon. She had been there. She carried it in the specific physical way that certain memories lived in the body. in the tension of her jaw when she thought about it, in the involuntary stillness that came over her if something in her peripheral vision echoed the geometry of that space. She had not spoken about it in 6 years to anyone who didn't already know. 11 links, one for each person who'd walked in. Not all of them had walked out in the same condition. "You said someone accessed my service record," she said, "and someone questioned Vargas. What are they looking for specifically?" "A documentation trail," Farr said. "Halcyon was supposed to be fully erased, personnel files, mission logs, everything. Someone is trying to confirm whether any documentation survived in places they didn't sanitize." "Did it?" He glanced at her. "That depends," he said, "on what you kept." Nora said nothing. He pulled up to a stoplight and let the silence sit. She had in fact kept something, not much. Not enough to be called evidence in any formal sense, but a specific item in a specific place that she had held on to for reasons she'd never fully articulated even to herself. Something between obligation and refusal, a choice not to let a thing simply disappear because people with power needed it to. She wasn't going to tell Farr that. Not yet. "Drop me at the address," she said. He drove the rest of the way without pushing. Vortin. The motel on Rimrock Road was exactly what Farr had described. Small, clean, the kind of place that had been there long enough to have no pretensions about itself. The owner was a heavy-set man in his 60s who looked up from a small television when Nora came in through the side entrance, nodded at her, and handed her a key without a word. Room 7. She locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and didn't move for about 3 minutes. Her father's funeral had been 4 days ago. She had driven 2 hours from the cemetery to the airport and worked a double shift on the way back because her replacement had called in sick, and the unit was short-staffed and she hadn't been able to say no, which was a problem she'd had her entire life. She had eaten half a sandwich at some point between midnight and 4 in the morning. She had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since Monday. She was, by any objective measure, in no condition to deal with what was apparently happening. She picked up her phone and called Red Haven General. Got the night supervisor on the 3rd ring. "It's Callahan. Is Marcus there tonight?" A pause. "Dr. Myers?" "He's on until 6. Put me through to the floor." She waited. Got the unit desk. Heard the background noise of a working trauma floor. Monitors, voices, the particular acoustic quality of linoleum and fluorescent lights, and felt something settle in her chest despite everything. Myers picked up on the 2nd ring. "What?" "I'm calling about the Weston case," she said. "The PICC line placement from this morning. It's handled." "Who placed it?" A beat. "Renner." "Renner's still orienting. Did someone supervise?" "Callahan? Did someone supervise, Marcus?" Another beat. Longer. "I was in the room." "Okay," she said. "Good." She could hear him not saying something on the other end of the line. The particular quality of a silence that contained irritation and something else, possibly gratitude, though he would rather have had the PICC line fail than admit to gratitude, which was also a problem he had. "Are you coming back Thursday?" he said. "Planning on it." "Good," he said, and hung up. She put the phone down. Then she called a different number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. "Vargas," she said. "It's Callahan. I know they told you not to use the phone after 9, but pick up when you get this." She paused. "Someone's been asking questions. Don't answer any more of them. Not without me." Another pause. "I'll be there in 2 days." She hung up. Lay back on the bed with her boots still on. The ceiling had a water stain in one corner shaped loosely like a hand. She thought about Adrian Costas. The laugh. The way she'd moved through a crisis. Not calm exactly, but precise, like a machine that had been calibrated for chaos. She had been 31 when she died. A house fire in eastern Oregon that closed in 6 weeks. Nora had read the obituary and not been able to finish it. She set an alarm for 5:15 and was asleep in under 4 minutes. Farr called at 6:12. "I have a partial," he said. The access request came through a contractor portal registered to a firm called Halston Meridian Group. Federal consulting based out of D.C., but they have a regional office here. Halston, the city she'd just landed in. "Who runs the regional office?" she said. Man named Preston Carr, former DOD, mid-level, left federal service about 3 years ago. He's been building a client list in the Mountain West ever since. A pause. He has a meeting today at 10, at the Meridian Plaza Hotel downtown. With who? Farr hesitated. Gary Birch. She sat up. There it was. Not a coincidence, not a tangent, not the kind of connection you could wave away. Birch ran the hospital where she worked. Birch was having dinner last night with Marcus Hale, who had known exactly which flight she was on, which she hadn't told anyone because she'd booked it the morning of the funeral on a bereavement fare under a name she rarely used. How does Hale connect? She said. Still working on that, but Hale's company has done financial work for at least 2 of the hospital acquisitions Birch has been involved in. She stood and moved to the window. The street outside was quiet. A dry cleaner not yet open, a pickup truck idling at the corner. Farr, she said. Why does any of this require eliminating phantom operatives? What does Halcyon have to do with hospital acquisitions in Montana? Birch's private equity group, Farr said. It's called Meridian Capital Group, the same family of names as the contractor firm. When I started pulling the thread, he stopped, restarted. One of the facilities they acquired, a trauma center in Nevada, was used as a payment node in a financing arrangement that traces back to a government contract connected to the program that ran Halcyon. The pieces were not fully forming yet, but the shape of them was becoming visible. Someone laundered money through hospital acquisitions, she said, and the Halcyon mission was part of the original operation. Not laundered exactly, more like diverted. Allocated funds that were officially attributed to a classified program went somewhere else. The program was Halcyon. The somewhere else was the acquisition chain. He paused. If any documentation from Halcyon surfaces, mission logs, personnel records, anything with dates that match the financial transfers, the whole structure becomes traceable. And I'm traceable, she said. The unit is traceable, he said. You specifically, your service record was accessed because you had a secondary role on Halcyon that put you in proximity to some of the financial handoffs. You wouldn't have understood what you were seeing at the time, but if you were deposed and someone walked you through it, I'd be a witness, she said. You'd be the witness, Farr said. The only one still operating in the open. Vargas is hospitalized. The others are dead. You're working in a hospital that Birch is actively targeting for restructuring, which would put you out of a job and disrupt any institutional standing you have. And your service records, if they get to them first, could be altered or flagged in ways that make your credibility. Stop, she said. He stopped. She was thinking. The restructuring at Red Haven. The fresher approach, younger staff that Marcus Hale had mentioned on the plane, with the casual certainty of a man who'd already heard the outcome. The unauthorized access to her service record. Costas dead, Teal dead, Vargas unreachable. And she'd been on a plane with Marcus Hale. Who knew Gary Birch? Who was in Halston for a dinner that coincided with the 10 o'clock meeting between Birch and the man who'd accessed her records. She didn't believe in coincidences. She'd spent too many years in operations where the things that looked like coincidences were the things that killed you. I need to be at that meeting, she said. Nora, not in the room, outside it. I need to see who's there and how they interact and whether Hale is present. That's not... You said you needed the surviving phantom operatives. You need me, which means right now I'm a resource you're trying not to damage, and the way you keep me from getting damaged is to let me do this the way I know how to do it. A beat. I've done reconnaissance in far worse conditions than a hotel lobby. A long pause on the line. The meeting's in a private dining room, Farr said. Hotel's on 5th and Clark. I'll text you what I have on the layout. Thank you. Be careful, he said. It came out differently than she expected, not tactical, just human. I'm always careful, she said, which was mostly true. The Meridian Plaza Hotel was the kind of place that had been grand in the 90s and was still trading on the memory of it. High ceilings, patterned carpet, a lobby bar that opened at 11 and probably did good business from noon on. Nora arrived at 9:40 in clothes she'd bought from the Target on Grand Avenue. Dark slacks, a gray button-down, a blazer that fit well enough. She'd paid cash, kept the receipt, and changed in the store bathroom. She looked like a consultant. or an attorney, or the kind of person who moved through hotel lobbies without anyone thinking to look twice. The private dining room was off the main corridor, past the business center, behind a set of frosted glass doors with the room number etched in the center. There was a small seating area in the corridor, 2 chairs and a table with a lamp, positioned at the kind of angle that gave a clear sightline to the frosted doors while appearing to be simply a waiting area. Nora sat down, opened her phone, looked at it. At 9:58, Gary Birch arrived. She recognized him from the hospital's administrative directory photo, though he looked different in person. Heavier through the shoulders, more deliberate in his movement, the kind of man who had decided at some point that projecting calm was a form of power and had practiced it long enough to get fairly good at it. He came with an aide, a young man carrying a leather portfolio, and they went through the frosted doors without looking at Nora at all. Preston Carr arrived at 10:03. She identified him from the Halston Meridian Group website, which Farr had texted her. Late 50s, wire-rimmed glasses, the build of a man who'd been athletic 20 years ago and hadn't entirely let it go. He had a second man with him she didn't recognize, tall, 50s, close-cropped gray hair. He walked with the specificity of a military background. Not current, but recent. She photographed them on her phone as they passed. Natural movement, phone at message reading height, 3 frames in a row. She sent them to Farr. Then she waited. 22 minutes later, the frosted doors opened and Marcus Hale walked out. He was on his phone, talking in the low, compressed tone of a man finalizing details. He didn't see her. He moved past the seating area, down the corridor, and turned toward the elevator. She hadn't known he was in there. Farr hadn't known either, or he would have said, which meant Hale wasn't on Farr's radar as a direct actor. He was something else, a peripheral connection, maybe, or a deeper one that had been deliberately obscured. She texted Farr. Hale was in the meeting. Who is the gray-haired man with Carr? The reply came in 4 minutes. Working on it. Don't move yet. She didn't move. At 10:39, the meeting broke. Birch came out first, spoke briefly to his aide, and left. Carr and the gray-haired man came out together, and she caught a fragment of what they were saying through the way the corridor acoustics briefly carried sound when the doors swung open. 3 weeks is too long. The board moves Thursday, and if she's still on the floor, the doors swung closed. She had enough. She walked out of the hotel the same way she'd come in, unhurried, unremarkable, the kind of person no one would remember. On the sidewalk, her phone buzzed. Gray-haired man, Colonel Alan Driscoll. Retired, DIA. He was the senior officer who signed the final Halcyon mission parameters. She stopped walking. Driscoll. She knew that name. She'd never met him, but she knew the name the way you knew the names of people who held your life in their hands from a distance. From briefing documents, from the chain of command that extended above the people you could see, from the signatures on orders that came down through channels and arrived already final. Driscoll had signed the Halcyon parameters, which meant Driscoll knew exactly what the mission had actually been, and exactly what had happened in the last 6 hours. And Driscoll was in a private dining room in Halston, Montana, with the man who ran the hospital where Nora worked, and a federal contractor who had accessed her service record without authorization. Her phone buzzed again. There's more. Driscoll currently sits on the board of Meridian Capital Group, the same Meridian Capital Group that was acquiring trauma centers, that was circling Red Haven General, that was connected, through financial transfers, to the Halcyon program's diverted funds. The man who'd signed her mission parameters was on the board of the company trying to dismantle the hospital where she worked, had almost certainly had her service record access to assess her as a threat, had been in the same meeting as Marcus Hale, who had sat 2 seats away from her on a flight that she hadn't told anyone she was taking. The sun was up fully now, bright and flat over the Montana streets. A few cars passed. Someone walked a dog on the opposite sidewalk. Nora stood on the pavement outside the Meridian Plaza Hotel and felt the specific cold that wasn't weather. The cold of realizing the shape of something you'd been peripherally sensing for months. The cold of the moment when what felt like paranoia resolves into pattern. She called Farr. Driscoll, she said. I know. He's not peripheral, he's the center of it. Yes, Farr said. That's what I've been trying to confirm. You already knew. A pause. I suspected. I needed corroboration. And now you have it. Now I have it. She started walking. Didn't know where yet. Just the physical need to move, to let her body work while her mind ran the problem. If Driscoll signed the halcyon parameters, she said, and the financial diversion traces back to that mission, then he's not just protecting a career, he's protecting a federal crime. Multiple federal crimes, Farr said. Misappropriation of classified funds, obstruction, and, depending on what you can testify to, potentially worse. He needs me neutralized, she said. Discredited at minimum. Removed from institutional standing. If you're fired from Red Haven and your service record has been altered to suggest psychological instability, no one takes my testimony seriously, she said. Correct? She thought about the younger, fresher approach, about the unauthorized access, about Teal at the bottom of a parking garage stairwell, about Costas in a burning house in Oregon. Farr, she said, what do you need from me to build a case? Documentation, he said. Anything that ties the financial transfers to the Halcyon timeline. Dates, locations, anything you observed in the field that you can place with specificity. She had something. She'd known it since last night on the plane when he'd said the word documentation, and she'd made the decision not to tell him yet. She was close to making a different decision. Give me until tonight, she said. Nora, tonight, Farr. He let it go. She hung up and walked 2 more blocks, and stopped at a bus shelter and stood with her back to the street and ran through the chain of it again. Driscoll, Birch, Carr, Hale. A retired colonel, a hospital administrator, a federal contractor, a businessman. 4 points of a shape she was still only seeing from one angle. What she didn't know yet, what was still dark, was what the 3 weeks meant. The board moves Thursday, and if she's still on the floor, Thursday was 6 days away. Whatever they were planning to do to her position at Red Haven, they had 6 days to do it. And if they'd been willing to access her service records and question a hospitalized veteran, and she was correct about Teal and Costas. 6 days was not very much time. She pulled out her phone and made a call she'd been putting off for 2 months. It rang 3 times. Callahan. The voice was a woman's, hoarse and immediate. The voice of someone who answered phones the way some people answered doors, already prepared for whatever's on the other side. Vasquez, Nora said, I need a favor. Lieutenant Commander Mara Vasquez, retired, JAG course, currently running a law practice in Denver that officially specialized in veterans' benefits and unofficially handled the kind of cases that other lawyers declined to touch, was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. How big a favor? Vasquez said. Significant. Define significant. Nora watched a pickup turn the corner at the end of the block. A woman walking a child past the bus shelter without looking up. I need you to help me build a federal case against a retired DIA colonel, a hospital administrator, and a federal contractor, she said. I have potential evidence, a witness in a VA facility, and a retired colonel on my side who can corroborate the mission background. Another 2-second silence. Are you in immediate danger? Vasquez said. Nora considered the question honestly. Not immediate, she said. But there's a timeline. 6 days, maybe less. Where are you? Halston. I can be there by tomorrow morning, Vasquez said. Don't talk to anyone else about this tonight. Don't go anywhere near the hospital. And Callahan, I know, Nora said. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to tell me not to do anything unilateral. A pause. Were you going to? Nora looked down the street. The Meridian Plaza Hotel was 2 blocks behind her, and somewhere inside it, or recently departed from it, were 3 men whose names were now threaded through the worst thing she had ever survived. Not yet, she said. Vasquez made a sound that was not reassured. I'll call you when I land. Nora pocketed the phone. Yow. She stood there another moment. The morning had gone warm in the particular surprising way of Montana fall, sun cutting through the earlier cool with real force. Her shoulder ached from the bag she'd been carrying for 20 hours. She was hungry, properly hungry, the kind that came from multiple missed meals, and she had a low headache sitting behind her right eye that she recognized as the beginning of the dehydration she'd been ignoring since Billings. She found a diner 3 blocks north, ordered eggs and coffee and water, and sat in a corner booth facing the door. She was going through everything methodically, what she had, what she needed, what the vulnerabilities were, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for 1 full ring, picked up. Callahan, she said. Static. Then a voice, thin and strained but unmistakable. It's Vargas, he said. She sat up straighter. They came to the facility this morning, he said. 2 men. Said it was a medication review. They had badges. His breathing was uneven. They asked me about you, Nora, about what you took out of the field. Her hand tightened on the phone. What did you tell them? She said carefully. Nothing. I told them I didn't remember anything, but they... He stopped. She could hear him pressing the phone closer. They know you have something. They said if you don't hand it over in 48 hours, they're going to make sure the facility loses its federal funding. The diner around her, the clatter of silverware, the low murmur of other tables, the smell of coffee and bacon grease went very distant. 48 hours, not 6 days. 48 hours. The timeline had moved. Vargas, she said, listen to me. Do not speak to anyone else today. If they come back, ask for an attorney and stop talking. Can you do that? Yes, he said. His voice was steadier now. Nora. Yeah. Whatever you took out of there. He paused. It was real, wasn't it? What happened? The eggs arrived in front of her, and she didn't look at them. It was real, she said. Then don't let them bury it again, he said. She stared at the table. The morning light came through the diner window at a low angle and laid a stripe of gold across the formica. I won't, she said. She hung up. 48 hours. She ate the eggs because she needed to, quickly and without tasting them, and drank the coffee and then a full glass of water, and sat for exactly 90 seconds after that with her hands flat on the table, feeling the specific quality of the choice that was now being made, whether she chose to make it or not. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her bag, past the ibuprofen, past the folded boarding pass, past the small zippered compartment that held her VA card and her father's unit patch that she'd taken from his dresser after the funeral and hadn't known what else to do with, and touched the edge of a small flat object she had carried for 6 years and never opened, a USB drive, matte black, half the size of her thumb. It contained documentation that should not exist, from a mission that had never officially happened, with dates and figures that would connect every thread Farr had been pulling for 11 months. She had carried it because her father taught her to always be able to find your own way home. Because Costas had laughed too loud and was now ashes. Because 11 people had walked into a place and not all of them had walked out intact, and someone had decided that was acceptable, and she had never, not once, decided it was. She left cash on the table and walked out into the morning with the drive still in her pocket and 48 hours in which to decide how to use it without getting herself, or Vargas, killed in the process. 2 blocks away, in a parked sedan she hadn't noticed before, a man in a gray jacket was watching the diner entrance with the focused patience of someone who had been there for a while. He was on his phone, and as Nora stepped onto the sidewalk, he started talking. She didn't run. Running was what people did when they hadn't been trained to understand that running was a signal. And signals were invitations, and the man in the gray jacket across the street was almost certainly waiting to see whether she'd move like someone who knew she was being watched. She didn't look at him either. Looking was the other mistake. The instinct that people couldn't override. The biological compulsion to confirm the threat, which was the same as confirming that you'd seen it. She turned left out of the diner and walked at the pace of someone with somewhere reasonable to be. Not fast, not slow. Hands out of pockets, her bag over one shoulder, slightly forward, where she could reach into it without stopping. In her peripheral vision, the sedan didn't move. The man was still on his phone. She made the next right, which took her off the main street and into a narrower block lined with a hardware store, a closed barber shop, and a dry cleaning operation that had its door propped open. She went into the dry cleaner, moved past the front counter with a brief nod at the woman behind it, and positioned herself at the back of the shop near the hanging racks where she could see the front window without being visible from the street. 30 seconds. The sedan rolled past the front of the shop at reduced speed. Didn't stop, kept going. She waited another 90 seconds, watching the window. No second pass. She came out through the side door, crossed the parking lot behind the hardware store, and came out on a street 1 block north of where she'd been. She walked 3 blocks before she pulled out her phone and called Farr. I have a tail, she said, or had one. Sedan, dark green, Montana plates. I lost it in a dry cleaner on Breckett. Farr was quiet for 3 seconds. How long? Since the diner, at minimum, possibly since the hotel. Did you make contact? No. Stay moving, he said. Don't go back to the motel. I'll come to you. She gave him a cross street and kept walking. The morning had gone fully bright now, and the city around her had the ordinary rhythm of a mid-sized western town at mid-morning. Delivery trucks, a group of college-aged kids with coffee cups, a woman pushing a stroller at the pace of someone who had nowhere to be but had learned to make that feel intentional. Nora moved through it with her face neutral and her mind running fast. The 48-hour window Vargas had given her meant the men at the facility had been operating on a timeline that was already in motion before she'd gotten off the plane, which meant they'd known she was coming to Billings before she'd boarded, which meant the connection to Hale ran deeper than a chance seating arrangement. He hadn't been next to her by accident, and his mention of Gary Birch and Red Haven's restructuring hadn't been casual. It had been a message, an assessment, a way to look directly at the target and measure what it knew. She thought about the flight, replaying it with different variables. Hale's loudness, his deliberate attention to her, the performance of contempt that had been precisely public. Not cruelty for its own sake, cruelty as a diagnostic. See how she responds. See if she shows her hand. See if a woman with 19 hours on her feet and a father 2 days in the ground breaks under social pressure the way someone with nothing to hide breaks, with anger or tears or the need to explain herself. She hadn't, which told them something. And something had been enough to put a man in a gray jacket outside the diner this morning. Farr pulled up in the blue Jeep 12 minutes later. She got in without slowing down, and he had the vehicle moving before her door was fully shut. I need you to tell me everything you know about Driscoll's network, she said. Not just Birch and Carr. Everyone. Farr drove. Driscoll ran intelligence operations in 3 theaters before he retired, he said. He built his network during that period. People he trusted, people he had leverage over, people who owed him. Carr's a loyalist from his DIA days. Birch came in through the financial side. He was recruited into the acquisition scheme after Driscoll identified him as someone who needed a revenue source and had the right institutional access. A pause. Hale is newer. He came in roughly 18 months ago through the private equity network. He does the client-facing work, introductions, political connections, smoothing things over at the board level. And the gray jacket? Contractor, probably one of 3 or 4 Carr uses for field work. He checked the mirror. Nora, the USB drive. She turned to look at him. His jaw was set and he was watching the road, but the question was fully formed in his expression even without him looking at her. You knew I had it, she said. I suspected. It's what I would have done. He paused. If Vargas told them you took something out of the field, then they already know it exists. Which means the 48 hours isn't a negotiation. It's a window to find you and take it. Or to do what they did to Teal, she said. Yes. She looked out the passenger window at the city moving past. What happens if I hand it to you right now? Then I have what I need and you're still in the open, Farr said. Handing me the drive doesn't make you less of a threat to them. You're a witness regardless. So the drive alone doesn't fix it. The drive is evidence, Farr said. But evidence needs a context it can survive in. If you're discredited before it surfaces, if your service record has been altered, if Red Haven terminates you for cause, if there's any kind of administrative action that lets them characterize you as unstable, she said. Yes. Then the drive becomes an anonymous document from an anonymous source, and a good attorney dismantles it. She pressed the back of her head against the seat. The city was thinning at the edges now as Farr drove toward the outskirts, the blocks getting wider and more industrial. I called Vasquez last night, she said. Farr glanced at her for the first time since she'd gotten in. Mara Vasquez. She's landing tomorrow morning. He absorbed that. Good, he said, and something in his posture changed, not dramatically, but measurably, like a load redistributed. That's good. In the meantime, Nora said, I need to get back to Red Haven. If they're planning to move against my position before Thursday, I need to be in that building. That's what they want, Farr said. Get you back on their terrain. I know, but if I'm not there, the restructuring happens without any resistance, and they establish the institutional record they need. She paused. And there's a patient on that floor who needs a competent nurse, and 2 residents who are still orienting, and a surgeon who is too good at his job to know how much he relies on the people around him. She said it plainly, not as justification, just as fact. I need to be there. Farr drove for a moment without speaking. Vasquez will need the drive when she lands, he said. She'll have it. And you'll need to be careful between now and then. The contractor who is watching you, he'll try again. Let him, Nora said, and she meant it in the specific clinical way she meant things when she'd made a decision and stopped second-guessing it. She was back in Red Haven by late afternoon. The drive had taken most of the day. She'd rented a car, a nondescript gray sedan, cash at a lot on the south edge of Halston that catered to the kind of customers who didn't mind a few extra questions. She'd taken the longer route, checking mirrors, stopping twice at places that had multiple exits. No one followed her. Red Haven was in the lower arm of the Clearwater Valley, a small city with a university and an old mining history and the particular character of places that had survived their original purpose and reinvented themselves without entirely forgetting the first version. She'd lived here for 4 years. She knew the roads, the seasons, the way the hospital smell hit you differently in winter than in summer. She didn't go home. She drove past her apartment building, 2 loops around the block, nothing she could identify as surveillance, and decided against stopping. If they'd done their research, and they had, they knew her address. She called Dr. Myers from the car. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant he was between patients. I need to talk to you, she said. Not over the phone. A pause. Is everything okay? When are you off shift? 7. There's a coffee place on Ardmore, the one with the green awning. Can you be there at 7:30? Another pause. Longer. Callahan, what's going on? I'll explain at 7:30, she said. I need you to listen without interrupting and without dismissing what I'm telling you, because it sounds like something you don't want to deal with. A very long pause. I'll be there, he said. She checked into a motel on the west side of town under a name that was on a secondary ID she'd maintained out of habit since the years when having a secondary ID was operationally standard. The room was unremarkable. She showered and changed and sat on the bed and opened the laptop she kept in her bag for travel and began building a document. Dates, names, observations. The chain of connections between Driscoll and Birch and Carr and the acquisition of trauma centers that had started 3 years ago and was now circling Red Haven like a slow tide. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. At 6:55, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Stop what you're doing. This doesn't end the way you think. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone face down, closed the laptop, and left for the coffee shop. Myers was already there when she arrived, which surprised her. He was constitutionally 5 to 8 minutes late, a habit she'd attributed to the fact that he was almost always finishing something when he was supposed to be starting something else. He was in street clothes, a flannel over a t-shirt, which made him look younger than his 34 years, and also less certain, as if the white coat was structural, and without it something shifted. He had 2 coffees on the table. Black, because he'd seen her drink coffee black for 4 years and retained that information, even though he would have claimed he paid no attention to things like that. Talk, he said when she sat down. She talked. Not everything. She was precise about what she gave him, calibrating for what he needed to understand and what would only create noise. She told him about Birch and the acquisition structure. She told him about the restructuring timeline and the Thursday board move. She told him that someone with a financial interest in converting Red Haven into an elective surgery facility had been actively working to have her removed from the hospital's staff, and that the pretext would likely involve a manufactured performance or conduct issue. Myers listened without interrupting, which was the thing she'd asked for and hadn't fully expected him to deliver. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. How solid is this? He said. Solid enough that I've brought in a JAG attorney. A JAG attorney? He looked at her. Callahan, what exactly did you do before you were a nurse? That's a separate conversation. Is it? For now, yes. She leaned forward slightly. What I need from you right now is simple. If anyone, Birch, the board, HR, anyone, approaches you about my performance, you tell the truth. Nothing embellished, nothing softened, just what you've actually seen. He looked at her steadily. And what have I actually seen? She held his gaze. A nurse who correctly identified an aortic dissection that you missed, she said. Among other things. He didn't look away. The words landed and he absorbed them without defense, which was one of the things she'd respected about him even when he irritated her. He had the rare quality of being able to hear something true that reflected badly on him without immediately working to discredit it. I'll tell the truth, he said. That's all I'm asking. He nodded, drank his coffee. Is this going to be a problem for the unit? It might be temporarily disruptive, she said, but if it goes the way I'm working to make it go, Red Haven will be in a better position after than before. He didn't ask her to elaborate. He just nodded again, the tight nod of someone who had decided to extend trust that they weren't sure they had enough information to extend, but were extending anyway. She drove back to the motel and worked until 2 in the morning. Vasquez landed at 6:48, 48 minutes behind schedule, due to a weather delay that had her tight-jawed and running on airport coffee when she met Nora in the rental car lot outside the Red Haven Regional Airport. She was 46, built lean and compact, with dark hair cut short on the sides, and the kind of eyes that evaluated everything once and retained it permanently. She'd spent 12 years in JAG Corps, the last 4 of which had involved cases that no one at the Pentagon was eager to talk about. Her practice in Denver handled veterans whose claims had been denied through systematic obstruction, service members who'd been pushed out on fabricated conduct charges, and occasionally situations like this one, where the line between legal strategy and operational necessity was fine enough to need someone who understood both sides of it. She and Nora had served parallel careers for a period that overlapped, and they knew each other with the specific plainness of people who'd never had reason to perform for each other. You look terrible, Vasquez said. I've been up since 2, Nora said. Drive and tell me everything. Nora drove. She told her everything. This time she held nothing back. The full halcyon background, the mission parameters, what had happened in the last 6 hours that the official record didn't contain, what she'd observed in the field that connected the financial transfers to the operation. Vasquez listened without speaking, occasionally making a note on a legal pad she held on one knee. When Nora finished, Vasquez was quiet for nearly a minute. You've been carrying the drive for 6 years, she said. Yes. And no one knew. Far suspected. No one else. What's on it exactly? Mission logs. Daily records that the unit kept for internal operational purposes. Not formal documentation, but specific enough to contain dates, coordinates, the names of personnel present at key moments, and one photograph. Of what? Nora's hands were steady on the wheel. A cash transfer. Physical transfer C. 2 cases. In a location that matches the mission coordinates within a 6-hour window. I was the only person in the unit with a camera at that point. I took it because... She stopped. I took it because something about it was wrong, and I didn't know what yet. And I had the instinct to document it. A combat medic with a field camera, Vasquez said. It was a phone. A secondary phone I wasn't supposed to have. Vasquez made a sound that was as close to a laugh as the situation allowed. Okay, she said. The photograph is the piece. Combined with the mission logs and the financial documentation FAR has been building, it's traceable, Nora said, directly to Driscoll. How many people does this implicate above Driscoll? I don't know. The transfer looked like it involved oversight from somewhere higher. I didn't have the context at the time to understand what I was seeing. Vasquez tapped her pen against the legal pad. Then we have to be careful about how this surfaces. If it goes up the chain and there's someone above Driscoll who has the kind of reach he has, I know. We don't file in Montana, Vasquez said. We file in D.C. District, federal, and we don't announce it. We make the filing and simultaneously notify the Inspector General's office and a specific individual in the Senate Armed Services Committee who has been looking for a thread to pull on exactly this kind of... You already have a contact, Nora said. I've had a contact for 2 years, Vasquez said. I was waiting for a case that was strong enough. This is strong enough. Nora turned onto the highway. The Clearwater Valley opened up ahead of them, wide and still, the mountains in the distance, the sky a deep clear blue that was almost aggressive in its clarity. We have 48 hours from when Vargas called me, Nora said, which means by tonight. Then we move today, Vasquez said. Give me the drive. Nora reached into her bag with one hand and put the USB drive on the center console between them. Vasquez looked at it for a moment, then picked it up. "You've been carrying this for 6 years," she said again. Not a criticism, more like acknowledgement. "I didn't know what to do with it," Nora said, "and I didn't know who to trust. And now?" Nora watched the road. "Now I'm running out of time," she said. They spent the morning in Vasquez's rental car in the parking lot of a public library, working through the documentation. Vasquez had a laptop and a portable scanner and a legal mind that moved fast without cutting corners, and she built the filing architecture with the methodical speed of someone who had done this under worse conditions. Farr joined them at 11. He and Vasquez had a brief professional exchange that contained several years of mutual awareness folded into about 3 sentences, and then they worked. By 1 in the afternoon, the core filing was assembled. The photograph, exported from the drive, authenticated against the mission log metadata, was the linchpin. Farr's documentation on the financial transfers connected to the acquisition structure was the secondary layer. Nora's formal statement, which she wrote herself in clear, unadorned language, was the witness record. "I need to make 3 copies," Vasquez said. "One files electronically with the DC district. One goes to my Senate contact directly by encrypted courier. One stays with Farr in a secure location." "What about Driscoll's timeline?" Nora said. "If the board moves Thursday, if we file today, by tomorrow morning there will be notification to a federal judge requesting an emergency injunction against any adverse employment actions pending investigation. That covers you and Red Haven. Will it hold?" "It will slow them down, long enough." Vasquez looked at her. "There are no guarantees here. I want to be clear about that. We're not in a film. This could get complicated before it gets clean." "It's already complicated," Nora said. "More complicated than this," Vasquez said. "If Driscoll has the reach I think he has, there will be pressure on the judge. There will be challenges. This could take months to fully resolve." "I know," Nora said. "File it anyway." Vasquez filed at 2:17 p.m. The confirmation came through in 8 minutes. Federal docket number, filing timestamp, automatic notification to the respondent's likely legal representatives that an action had been initiated. Nobody said anything for a moment. Nora was looking at the public library through the windshield. A woman was walking out with 2 children and a stack of books, and one of the children dropped a book, and the woman stopped and waited, while the child picked it up and didn't hurry her, just waited. And then they kept walking. "Now we wait," Vasquez said. "I'm going to the hospital," Nora said. Vasquez turned. "Today? My shift starts at 3. She paused. "I'm a nurse. I have patients. The filing is done, and I've done what I can do from here. And if Driscoll's people are going to move anyway, I want to be in that building where everything is on the record." Vasquez held her gaze. "If someone comes at you there, then it happens in a public institutional setting with witnesses," Nora said, "which is better than a parking garage stairwell." Vasquez had nothing to counter that with. She glanced at Farr. "I'll be close," Farr said. Nora got out of the car. The trauma floor at Red Haven General had its particular smell, antiseptic over something warmer and more human, a combination she'd stopped consciously registering years ago, but which still activated something. She changed into scrubs in the locker room, clocked in at 3:02, and got report from the outgoing day charge. 6 patients currently in her zone. 1 fresh post-op abdominal, 2 observation holds, 1 pediatric fever case pending pediatrics consult, 1 dialysis patient waiting on a transport slot, and 1 new admit who'd come in through the ED an hour ago. The new admit was in Bay 4. 31 years old, female, altered mental status, brought in by a family member who said she'd been increasingly confused and had 2 episodes of what looked like generalized seizure activity in the past 4 hours. Nora went to Bay 4. The patient, her name was Joelle Pratt, according to the armband, was lying on her back with her eyes partially open but not tracking. Her color was off in a specific way, a grayish pallor that sat under her normal skin tone. Her breathing was regular but had a pattern to it that Nora clocked immediately, slightly too controlled, with a subtle lengthening of the expiratory phase that suggested her brain was fighting for pressure regulation. The ED had a working diagnosis of alcohol withdrawal seizure. Nora looked at the chart. No alcohol history. One previous seizure documented 3 years ago. Etiology unresolved. Current medications. 1 antidepressant, no anticonvulsants. Blood pressure on admission, 160/95. She took Joelle's blood pressure herself. Got 168/104. She lifted Joelle's left eyelid and checked pupillary response. The right pupil reacted normally. The left pupil was slightly sluggish, not dramatically. The kind of asymmetry that was easy to miss in a busy ED, especially if you were anchoring to the working diagnosis. Nora's chest tightened. She picked up the bedside phone and called the ED attending. "This is Callahan in the trauma unit. I need a neurology consult on Pratt and Bay 4 right now. She needs a CT head with contrast. The working diagnosis needs to be reconsidered." The attending, she didn't know him, a locum she'd seen twice, said, "The diagnosis is alcohol withdrawal. She has no alcohol history and her pupils are asymmetric," Nora said. "She needs imaging." The admitting physician cleared her in 40 minutes during a busy ED shift. "I'm looking at the patient right now. She needs a CT." A pause. "I'll call neuro." "Thank you," she said, and hung up. She stayed with Joelle, talking to her in the low, even tone she used with altered patients, not demanding response, just providing an anchor, and kept her hand on the patient's pulse while she watched the monitor. 8 minutes later, the neurologist on call walked into Bay 4. Dr. Sylvie Park was 50, brisk, and had the quality of someone who had been woken up and was awake before she arrived. She examined Joelle in 2 minutes and looked at Nora. "When did the pupil asymmetry start?" "I don't know. It's not in the ED documentation." Park was already on the phone calling for an emergency CT slot. Nora stepped back and let her work. She was standing in the Bay 4 curtain when the charge nurse, a woman named Ruth, who had been at Red Haven for 22 years and had the institutional memory of a cathedral, appeared at her shoulder. "Callahan," Ruth said quietly. "HR called down. There's someone in the administrative wing who wants to see you." Nora kept her eyes on Bay 4. "Now?" "They said as soon as you were available." "I'm not available," Nora said. "I have a critical patient." Ruth paused. "They were pretty insistent." "So am I," Nora said. Ruth looked at her for a moment, reading something in her posture that made Ruth, who had seen a great deal in 22 years, take a half step back. "I'll tell them you're with a patient," Ruth said. "Thank you." Joelle Pratt went to CT at 3:47. The scan came back at 4:22. Nora was reading the preliminary report on the unit terminal when the words resolved into what she'd feared they would be. A large subdural hematoma with midline shift. Not a trauma case, not alcohol withdrawal. A bleed in the brain that had been building quietly and was now pressing against structures that controlled everything. She was already moving toward the nursing station to make the call for emergency neurosurgery when the door to the unit opened and Gary Birch walked in. He was wearing a suit, which people in administration occasionally did when they came to the floor for official purposes, and he had a woman from HR beside him and a man Nora didn't recognize behind them, and his face was carrying the particular expression of someone who had prepared themselves to be reasonable in the face of unreasonableness. He looked at her. "Ms. Callahan," he said, "we need to talk." She looked at him, then at the CT report on the screen beside her, then at the clock above the nursing station. "I have a patient who needs emergency neurosurgery in the next 40 minutes, she said. "We can talk after I make that call." "This really can't—" "Mr. Birch," her voice was so level it stopped him mid-sentence. "There is a 31-year-old woman in Bay 4 with a subdural hematoma and midline shift. If I don't get a neurosurgical team on the phone in the next 3 minutes, she will herniate and she will die. Whatever you came here to tell me can wait 4 minutes. She held his gaze. "Unless you'd like to explain to the subsequent inquiry why the hospital's CEO interrupted the nurse who was trying to prevent a preventable death." The HR woman looked at Birch. The man behind them was very still. Birch's jaw tightened. 4 minutes, he said. Nora turned to the phone and made the call. The neurosurgery resident answered on the second ring. She gave him the scan findings in exactly the right order. Size of the bleed, midline shift measurement, current GCS, rate of BP change. And he said, "I'm coming down," before she'd finished the sentence. which was the correct response and the one she'd needed. She hung up and turned around. Birch was still there. The HR woman. The unknown man. And behind them, at the unit door, 2 other men had come in. Men she recognized from Farr's description of Carr's field contractors. They weren't in suits. They looked wrong for the space, the way people looked wrong when they were operating outside their environment and trying to compensate with stillness. The charge nurse Ruth was at the station, watching all of it with the expression of someone who understood that something was happening that was larger than the trauma floor and was not sure which way to stand. The neurosurgery resident came through the door at a near run, passing the 2 men without looking at them, going straight to Bay 4. Nora stood between Birch and the unit interior. "Now I'm available," she said. And then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Vasquez. "Federal notification just went out. Driscoll's attorney responded in 22 minutes. They're challenging on jurisdictional grounds. Judge is reviewing." She pocketed the phone. Birch reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. "Nora Callahan," he said, with the tonal formality of a man reading from a script he'd rehearsed, "I'm notifying you that effective immediately, your employment at Red Haven General is suspended pending an administrative review of conduct and clinical performance concerns." He held out the document. "This is your suspension notice. Per hospital policy, you're required to vacate the floor." Ruth made a sound at the nursing station that was almost a word and wasn't. Myers appeared from the direction of the break room, still in his white coat, and stopped when he saw the scene. His eyes moved from Birch to Nora, to the 2 men by the door, and back to Nora, and she could see him working through it. The coffee shop conversation, the things she'd told him to listen for, the moment he'd agreed to tell the truth arriving 4 days earlier than either of them had expected. "On what grounds?" Nora said. "Insubordination, clinical overreach, and—" "Mr. Birch," she said, and her voice was quiet and very clear. "I need you to understand something. As of 2:17 this afternoon, a federal filing was made in the D.C. District Court naming you, Preston Carr, Alan Driscoll, and Marcus Hale in connection with misappropriation of classified federal funds, unauthorized access to protected military service records, and actions constituting potential obstruction of justice." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The filing includes documentation connecting Meridian Capital Group's acquisition of regional trauma centers to financial transfers made during a classified military operation 7 years ago. The fluorescent light above the nursing station hummed. Ruth had stopped moving entirely. Myers had gone very still in the way he went still when a patient's vitals did something his diagnostic framework hadn't anticipated. Birch's face had done something complicated and then gone flat. Flat in the way that happened when a person's body understood the situation before their mind was willing to. "Whatever you think he started. "The suspension notice is fine," Nora said. "Keep it. It'll be part of the record." She took the document from his hand. "But I'm going to ask you, right now, in front of a charge nurse with 22 years of institutional memory and a physician who is standing 12 feet away, whether you want to physically remove a nurse from a unit with a patient currently in emergency neurosurgical preparation." She tilted her head slightly. "Because that answer is also going to be part of the record." The 2 men by the door exchanged a look. Birch looked at the HR woman. The HR woman looked at the floor. From Bay 4, the sounds of organized emergency movement, the specific cadence of a team around a critical patient, the low, urgent voices, the equipment moving, filtered into the unit. Nobody moved toward Nora. Nobody moved at all. And then, from the direction of the unit entrance, a 3rd man appeared. Not far, not anyone from Birch's group. A man in a dark suit with a federal ID badge clipped to his lapel, who looked at the assembled scene with the flat, unimpressed expression of a federal agent who had been told what to expect and was confirming that he'd been told correctly. He looked at Birch. He looked at the 2 contractors by the door. He looked at Nora. He said nothing yet. He simply stood there, making the geometry of the room entirely different. And in Bay 4, a 31-year-old woman named Joelle Pratt was still alive. And a neurosurgical team was working to keep her that way, because a nurse who should have been gone 2 hours ago had looked at her pupils and known what she was seeing and refused to stop being in the room. The federal agent's name was Special Agent Thomas Reed, and he had been with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for 11 years. And he had the specific quality of a man who had seen enough institutional dishonesty to have stopped being surprised by it without having stopped being offended by it. He looked at Gary Birch the way you looked at something you'd been told to expect, and were confirming the description was accurate. "Mr. Birch," he said, "I'm going to need you and your associates to come with me." Birch turned. The full turn of a man who had walked into a room expecting to hold the power in it, and was finding the architecture entirely different from what he'd been told. "I'm in the middle of an—" "I know what you're in the middle of," Reed said. He didn't raise his voice. There was no need. The badge on his lapel was doing the necessary work. "That's why we're having this conversation now rather than later." The HR woman, her name was Patricia Saul, 14 years at Red Haven, a person who had spent her career administering policies written by people above her without fully examining them, looked at the suspension notice in Birch's hand and made the smallest possible movement away from him. Not dramatic, not a statement, just the physical instinct of someone triangulating which way the weight was falling. The two contractors by the door had gone very still. One of them had his hand near his jacket pocket in a way that was probably habitual rather than intentional, but Reed saw it and his eyes moved there, and the contractor's hand went to his side instead. "And those two," Reed said, without looking away from Birch, "are going to stay right where they are until my colleagues come in." Two more agents came through the unit door 20 seconds later. They had the same flat, purposeful energy as Reed, the kind of energy that made a space smaller without raising a voice. Ruth, at the nursing station, had one hand on the counter and was watching all of it with the expression of someone who had spent 22 years believing that institutions, at their core, were mostly honest, and was revising that belief in real time. Myers was still standing near the break room door. He hadn't moved. He was watching Nora with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not quite the face he made when he was working through a diagnosis, more like the face he made when a diagnosis resolved into something he hadn't wanted it to be, but was now obligated to treat. Birch looked at the suspension notice in his hand. Then he looked at Nora. She said nothing. She had nothing she needed to say. He put the notice in his jacket pocket with the mechanical movement of someone whose body was completing a motion that had lost all its intended meaning. Reed gestured toward the unit corridor. Birch walked. The HR woman followed, not because she was being asked to, Reed hadn't asked her to, but because standing still felt worse. The two contractors went with the other agents, not handcuffed, not arrested, but contained in the particular way that authority contains people when it wants to, through posture and positioning and the unspoken understanding that cooperation is the only version of this that ends tolerably. The unit door closed. Ruth exhaled. Myers crossed to the nursing station and stood next to Nora and looked at the empty doorway. "That was not 4 minutes," he said. "No," she said. "Do you want to tell me what just happened?" "Later," she said. "Right now I need to check on Bay 4. Joelle Pratt went to surgery at 4:51. The neurosurgical team, led by a surgeon named Dr. Alicia Van, who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had done this enough times to have burned away everything unnecessary, moved fast and cleanly. The bleed was a chronic subdural that had rebled acutely, the kind of thing that built slowly over weeks and then declared itself all at once with exactly the presentation Joelle had shown: confusion, seizure-like activity, an altered mental status that could be misread as half a dozen other things if you weren't looking at the right data points in the right order. Nora stood outside the OR suite for 12 minutes after they went in, not because there was anything she could do, but because leaving felt wrong. And she had learned over the years to honor the feeling that told her to stay present, even when presence was not functional. Her phone buzzed. Vasquez. Judge granted the emergency injunction. No adverse employment actions can be taken against you pending full review. Notification went to Red Haven's legal counsel 5 minutes ago. She read it twice. Then she put her phone away and went back to the unit. Farr was in the parking lot of a diner 2 blocks from the hospital in the blue Jeep when she found him at 6:30. He handed her coffee through the window without being asked. She got in. "Reed's good," Farr said. "He's been building a public corruption case on the periphery of this for 18 months. When Vasquez's filing came through, it was like someone handing him the centerpiece of a puzzle he'd been working from the edges." "Who else did they bring in?" Nora said. "Carr was picked up at his hotel in Halston 2 hours ago. Warrants are out for Driscoll and Hale. Driscoll's attorney has been making calls, but the photograph from the drive it's not arguable, Nora. The metadata is intact, the coordinates match the mission file, the dates are within a 6-hour window of a financial transfer that Reed can document independently. Farr paused. They can't walk it back. She drank the coffee. It was too hot and she drank it anyway. Driscoll will fight it, she said. He will. Men like him always do. He'll try jurisdiction. He'll try classification. Argue the whole thing should be sealed under national security. And he'll try to discredit the source. Farr looked at her. Which means you. Let him try. He has resources. So do I, apparently, she said. She didn't mean it arrogantly. She meant it in the precise sense. Vasquez, Farr, Reed, Myers, Ruth, the federal docket number, the intact metadata on a 6-year-old photograph taken on a secondary phone by a woman who had been trained to notice things that were wrong and document them before she understood why. Farr looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more considered, someone who needed more convincing. I'd been waiting for the right moment for 6 years, she said. I just needed the timeline to move. He nodded. Drank his own coffee. What about Vargas? She said. Vasquez's team is at the facility tonight. The men who came to question him have been identified, both contractors associated with Carr. That's obstruction of a protected witness, which adds to the stack. Farr paused. Vargas is okay. Shaken, but okay. She breathed. Elio Vargas, 24 years old when he went into the field, with his folded piece of paper and his scar and his hands that shook when things got loud. He was 31 now, in a room somewhere outside Carson City, probably folding something. I need to go see him, she said. After this settles. After, she agreed. Sick. The news cycle moved fast. Not because anyone leaked deliberately, or if they did, it was someone at a level Nora had no visibility into, but because the federal warrants were public records once served, and there were 2 journalists at regional outlets who had been watching the hospital acquisition pattern in the Mountain West for months and had sources at the courthouse who called when something landed. By 8 p.m. that evening, the first story was online. Federal investigation targets hospital acquisition network in Montana and Nevada. By 9:30, a second story with more detail. Former DIA colonel named in federal filing connecting classified military operation to private equity scheme. Nora read them both on her phone in the hospital break room, eating a granola bar she'd found in her locker that was 2 weeks past its best-by date and didn't care. The stories were accurate in their broad strokes and imprecise in their details, the way early breaking news always was. The photograph from the drive was described as classified field documentation, without specifics. Driscoll was named, but his role was characterized tentatively, and the hospital acquisition angle was laid out more clearly than the Halcyon connection because the financial records were more accessible than the military ones. But the shape was there. Anyone reading carefully could see the shape. Her phone had 43 missed calls and messages. She ignored all of them except 2. The first was from her brother in Portland, who had seen the news and wanted to know if she was okay. She texted back, I'm okay. I'll explain soon. I'm sorry I missed your last 2 calls. The second was from an unknown number, a text. Ms. Callahan, this is Senator Brenda Harwick's office. The senator is requesting a call at your earliest convenience. She stared at that one for a moment. Vasquez had mentioned a contact on the Senate Armed Services Committee. She hadn't given a name. She typed back, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. The response came in under a minute. Confirmed. Bob. Joelle Pratt came out of surgery at 10:47. Dr. Van found Nora on the unit before going to speak to the family, which was the kind of professional courtesy that didn't have a formal name but meant something. Good catch, Van said. She said it simply, the way surgeons said things when they meant them and didn't have time for more. The alcohol withdrawal diagnosis would have killed her by morning. The pupil asymmetry was subtle, Nora said. That's why most people miss it, Van said, and moved toward the family waiting room. Nora finished her charting. At 11:15, Ruth appeared at her elbow with a look on her face that combined several things that Ruth didn't usually let combine: relief, indignation on someone else's behalf, and the particular expression of a person who had been part of an institution for a long time and was recalibrating what that institution had been. Is the injunction real? Ruth said. It's real, so they can't, not without a federal judge lifting it, Nora said, which requires a hearing, which requires them to make their case, which, she stopped. It's real, Ruth. Ruth nodded. Then she said with the precision of someone who had been holding this for several hours, I've worked here for 22 years. I've watched them make changes to this unit that I didn't understand and I didn't push back on because pushing back wasn't my place. She paused. I'd like to make a statement to whoever needs one, if that helps. It helps, Nora said. Vasquez will call you. Ruth went back to her station with the bearing of someone who had decided something. Driscoll was arrested at 6:14 the following morning at a private residence in Northern Virginia. Nora heard about it from Farr, who texted her at 6:41. Driscoll in custody. Hale surrendered to his attorney last night. She was sitting on the edge of her motel bed, the secondary motel, the one on the west side, with her boots already on, having slept 5 hours and woken up without an alarm at 5:50, because her body still ran on field schedules regardless of how many years she'd been out of the field. She put her phone down, stood up, looked at her reflection in the motel mirror for a moment. The bruise on her collarbone, fully purple now, visible above her collar. The tiredness around her eyes. The way her face looked when she wasn't managing it for anyone else's benefit, which was different from the way it looked the rest of the time. She went and got breakfast at a place that served it all day, and for the first time in 4 days she ate a full meal without her mind running hard in the background. The Senate call was at 9. Senator Harwick's chief of staff handled the first 15 minutes, walking through the committee's interest in the Halcyon-adjacent financial investigation and what Nora's testimony could contribute to an oversight inquiry that had been in preliminary stages for several months. He spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that the subject was sensitive and the institutional interest was real and the politics of it were complicated. And Nora listened and asked 2 questions that made him stop and collect himself briefly before continuing. Senator Harwick herself got on at 9:17. She was in her 60s, and her voice had the quality of someone who had learned that directness was more efficient than performance. Ms. Callahan, she said, I want to be straightforward with you. What you've surfaced connects to something we've been trying to trace for a long time. The Halcyon mission was one piece of a larger pattern. Classified programs being used as financial conduits for private operations. Your documentation gives us something we haven't had, a dated, located, photographed evidence point that a court can hold. I understand, Nora said. I also want to be honest about what comes next. This will require your full testimony in closed session before the committee. It will require Farr's corroboration. It will take time, possibly many months. Driscoll's legal team will challenge every element of it. A brief pause. And at some point, some version of what you were involved in during Halcyon will become part of the public record. Not the classified details, those stay sealed, but your role, your unit, the existence of the operation. Nora was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Are you prepared for that? She thought about the 11 links on the anchor tattoo. Teal at the bottom of a stairwell, Costas in eastern Oregon, Vargas folding and refolding a piece of paper in a room outside Carson City. It should have been part of the record a long time ago, she said. A brief silence on the line. You'll be hearing from our office with logistics, Hark said. And Miss Callahan, what you did here, carrying that documentation, coming forward with it when you had every reason not to. Another pause. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's what I have right now. It's enough, Nora said. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Mom. She went back to Red Haven General that afternoon. Not as a suspended employee, the injunction made her status ambiguous in a way that Red Haven's legal counsel was apparently not eager to test, but because she had patience and paperwork that needed closing and a conversation she'd been putting off. The unit was quieter than the previous day. The particular quiet that followed upheaval when people were still processing what had happened and hadn't yet decided how to talk about it. Ruth acknowledged her with a nod that meant several things. The 2 orienting residents looked at her with the barely concealed curiosity of people who had heard something through the hospital grapevine and were trying to reconcile it with the person they'd known as their preceptor. Myers was in the break room. He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a chart he wasn't looking at, and the expression of a man who had spent the night revising his understanding of something. She sat down across from him. The aortic dissection, he said. Bay 7, last week. The pupil asymmetry yesterday. He paused. 12 other things I'm now rethinking. You're a good surgeon, she said. I'm an adequate surgeon with an excellent training program and a significant gap in clinical nursing perspective that I have been compensating for by being irritating, he said. It came out flat and self-aware, and it cost him something to say it, she could tell. She didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't entirely fine, and he knew that, and she respected him enough not to pretend otherwise. You told the truth when they asked, she said. He looked up. Ruth told me, she said, before the end of shift yesterday. When Reed's people were collecting statements, you gave them a full account of the dissection case and what happened. He looked back down at his chart. I said what happened. That's all I asked you to do. It still felt... He stopped. Restarted. It felt like more than that, given the context. It was more than that, she said. But you did it anyway. That matters. He was quiet for a moment. Where does this go from here? He said. For the hospital. The injunction protects the unit's current structure pending investigation. Birch's suspension was effective as of last night. The board moved fast once the warrants were served. She paused. The acquisition bid from Meridian Capital is frozen pending federal review. Red Haven stays what it is for now. He nodded slowly. And you? I have a Senate committee hearing in my future, she said, and a lot of paperwork. A ghost of something crossed his face that might, in different light, and from a different person, have been called relief. She stood up. Myers, she said. He looked up. Joelle Pratt is going to make a full recovery, she said. Van said she'll be out of ICU by Thursday. He held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said. It came out rougher than he probably intended. She went back to work. The press coverage accelerated over the next 48 hours in the way that coverage did when multiple threads converged into a single visible shape. Financial journalism covering the acquisition angle, defense and security reporters covering the Halcyon connection, political reporters covering Harwick's committee, and local outlets covering Red Haven specifically. Nora's name appeared in the third story that mentioned the whistleblower, identified only as a nurse and former military operative whose documentation provided the central evidence. By the fourth story, it was her full name. By the fifth, it was her name and the hospital and a detail about the suspension notice that had been served and immediately enjoined. She read none of them after the first two. She had never needed the documentation of other people's attention to know what had happened. She knew what had happened. She had always known. Carr, brought before a federal magistrate in Helena, declined to make a statement and was released on bail that his attorney had apparently arranged before the arrest had even been formally processed, which told you something about what Carr had anticipated and had prepared for. The bail was set at a level that suggested the judge had taken the flight risk seriously. Driscoll's attorney issued a statement that was legally careful and publicly aggressive. His client denied all allegations. The classification of the underlying materials made the entire proceeding improperly constituted. The so-called evidence was the product of an unauthorized breach of a sealed military operation. The statement was polished and firm and contained between its formal lines the first tremor of something that looked like fear. The specific fear of a man who had controlled the shape of a story for a long time and could feel it changing under his hands. Hale's attorney said less. Hale's attorney said almost nothing, which meant they were managing a client who had not expected to end up here and was not handling it gracefully. By the third day, 2 board members of Meridian Capital Group had voluntarily resigned. The law firm representing the group's Montana acquisitions filed a motion to withdraw from representation, citing conflicts they declined to specify. A financial news outlet reported that 3 of the group's pending hospital acquisition contracts had been suspended by the sellers pending review of the federal investigation. Nora was aware of all of this the way you were aware of weather. Real, present, significant, but happening at a scale that was adjacent to the immediate work of each day. The immediate work was a 44-year-old man in Bay 2 with a crush injury from a construction site who needed careful monitoring of compartment pressure in his left leg. A woman in Bay 6 recovering from a difficult procedure who was terrified in the specific way of people who had been given too much medical information too fast and needed someone to sit with them and translate it into terms that didn't feel like a sentence. Two residents who needed supervision and correction, and occasionally the specific look that communicated you've missed something without making them defensive about it. The work was the work. It had always been the work. On the fourth morning after Reed had walked onto her unit, Nora was eating lunch in the break room when Vasquez called. Driscoll's attorney moved to have the photograph excluded, Vasquez said, based on classification status of the underlying operation. Can they do that? They're trying. The argument is that the photograph was taken in the context of a classified mission, and the intelligence captured in it is therefore subject to executive privilege and national security protection. A pause. It's not a crazy argument. It's wrong, but it's not crazy. How do you counter it? The photograph doesn't show anything classified, Vasquez said. It shows two cases of currency in a physical location. That location happens to coincide with a classified operation, but the currency itself, the transfer, was not an authorized element of that operation. It was conducted in parallel to it, which is precisely what makes it criminal rather than protected. Another pause. I'm filing the response today. Judge Marlowe is sharp. She'll see it. And if she doesn't, then we fight it in appellate, and we use the financial documentation from Farr's side to establish the same connection through a different evidentiary path. Vasquez's voice was steady in the way it always was when she'd already thought 3 steps past the current obstacle. This doesn't hinge on the photograph alone, Nora. It helps, but we have the logs, Farr's records, Reed's independent documentation, and your testimony. They'd have to exclude all of it. Okay, Nora said. How are you holding up? She thought about it honestly. I'm okay, she said. I'm tired. I have a patient whose compartment pressures I'm watching every 2 hours, and a resident who is not yet sure she wants to be a nurse, and I'd like to get to my apartment at some point this week. Have you been back there? Not yet. Farr's confirmed the contractor surveillance was pulled when Carr was arrested. You should be clear. I know, She stopped. It feels premature. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. It's not premature, she said carefully. You've earned normal, Nora. Whatever normal looks like for you. After she hung up, Nora sat with her lunch and thought about what normal looked like. She wasn't sure she had a clear answer. She went home that evening. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Neat out of habit rather than preference. The kind of space that reflected someone who had learned not to accumulate things they'd have to leave behind. A few books. A good knife block in the kitchen. The dresser in the bedroom had a shallow dish on top where she kept small things. A coin from Missoula, a transit card from a city she'd lived in briefly, and her father's unit patch, which she'd moved there from her bag the night she got back. She sat on the couch for a while without turning on any lights. She thought about her father teaching her to read a compass at 9 years old. She thought about Costas's laugh. She thought about Vargas, who was alive and whose name she'd said to a federal attorney and a Senate office, and who was, for the first time in a long time, not forgotten. She was nearly asleep on the couch, still dressed, when her phone buzzed. Farr. Something just came up, not an emergency, but you need to know. She typed back. Tell me. 3 dots. Then, the photograph on the drive. We confirmed who took the photograph. But Reed's team found something else when they were processing Driscoll's financial records. She sat up. There's a secondary account, not connected to the acquisition structure. It was opened 4 months after Halcyon, in a different name. The transactions in it don't match the pattern we've been building. A pause. Then, the account received payments from 5 sources. We've identified 4 of them. 3 are connected to Driscoll's network, consistent with what we already have. But the 4th traces to a unit account, an operational budget account for a Tier 1 program. She was fully awake now. The 5th source is unidentified. No transaction origin, no correspondent bank. The money arrives and there's no upstream entry. Nora stared at the screen. The account was opened in the name of a holding company, Farr continued. We ran the holding company through the standard registries. It doesn't exist. It has never existed. But there's a registered agent on the incorporation documents. Another pause. Her phone screen felt very bright in the dark apartment. The registered agent is listed as N. Callahan. She read it 3 times. Her own name. On a holding company that had received payments from an operational budget account of a Tier 1 program. a holding company that didn't exist, documents she had never signed. Driscoll wasn't just trying to discredit her testimony, he had been building the frame for years. And she had walked into the middle of it with a USB drive that proved his guilt and her name already attached to the crime. She didn't panic. That was the first thing. The apartment was dark and her phone screen was bright, and her name was on a fraudulent holding company connected to a federal crime, and she sat there on the couch and did not panic because panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford and had long since stopped knowing how to do. She called Vasquez. It was 11:14 p.m. Vasquez picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been asleep either, which meant Farr had already called her. "I know," Vasquez said. "Farr called me 20 minutes ago. I've been reading the documents." "How bad is it?" "It's bad. Not unsurvivable, but bad." Vasquez's voice had the quality it got when she was working, stripped of everything non-essential, moving fast along the problem's actual edges. The incorporation documents were filed 3 years ago in Delaware. Registered agent listed as N. Callahan, with a partial address that matches your former residence in Nevada, the address you had when you were stationed there during the program. Nora closed her eyes for a moment. She had lived at that address for 14 months. It was in no public record. It had been a secure housing arrangement. The only people who should have had it were people with Tier 1 clearance. "Driscoll," she said. "Or someone in his network with that level of access," Vasquez said. "The document itself is a forgery. We can establish that. Your signature on the registration form doesn't match your actual signature. The notarization uses a notary commission number that expired 18 months before the document was supposedly filed." A pause. "But the account received real money, and the money is real, and your name is on the corporate record." "He built it to be found," Nora said. "Yes. If you surfaced, if you came forward with anything, this was waiting. An anonymous tip to the FBI, the documents surface, and suddenly the whistleblower is a suspect. The photograph becomes evidence you planted to cover your own involvement." Nora pressed her free hand flat against her thigh. "Can you dismantle it?" she said. "I can dismantle the forgery," Vasquez said. "The signature analysis alone will do it. A forensic documents examiner can establish that in 48 hours. The notary commission issue is even cleaner. But the timing matters. If Driscoll's attorney files a motion to introduce this before we've established the forgery, it controls the narrative in the press cycle, even if we eventually prove it false." She paused. "We need to move first." "How?" "I file a preemptive motion tomorrow morning establishing the fraudulent nature of the incorporation documents before they can introduce them. I also contact Reed tonight and give him the analysis. The FBI has forensic document examiners on staff, and if they confirm the forgery independently, it's not just our expert against theirs." Another pause. "But I need something from you." "What?" "The address on those documents was a secure housing address from your program period. Who had access to it?" Nora thought about that. The secure housing roster was maintained by the program's administrative officer. During the halcyon period, that had been a man named Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Paxton. Paxton had retired 4 years ago. She had never heard his name connected to Driscoll or to any of the financial threads Farr had been pulling. But someone had given Driscoll that address. 3 years ago, which was roughly when the acquisition scheme had started structuring itself against the possibility of exposure, which meant 3 years ago, Driscoll had been planning for the eventuality that a phantom survivor would resurface with documentation, and he had started building the frame then. "I have a name," she said. "Gerald Paxton, former administrative officer for the program. He had the housing rosters." "I'll have Farr run him," Vasquez said. "Vasquez," Nora said. "Yeah. How long have you been preparing for something like this? The JAG work, the committee contact, the framework you had ready to move when I called you." A short silence. 12 years, Vasquez said. "Since the first case I handled where someone with the right classification used it as a weapon against the person they were supposed to protect." She paused. "It's why I do what I do, in case you were wondering." Nora hadn't been wondering exactly, but it was good to know. "Get some sleep," Vasquez said. "Not a lot, but some. I need you sharp tomorrow." She put the phone down and lay back on the couch and set an alarm for 5, and slept. Vasquez filed the preemptive motion at 7:43 a.m. It was 22 pages, and it contained the forensic preliminary analysis of the signature discrepancy, The notary commission records showing the commission number had been expired for 18 months prior to the document's supposed filing date, and a detailed account of the secure housing address and its restricted access history, established through FAR's contacts within the DIA Records Office, who had confirmed the address's classification status and the finite list of personnel authorized to access it. At 7:51, before Driscoll's attorney had time to respond, Reed filed a parallel motion confirming the FBI's independent preliminary assessment that the incorporation documents were forged. At 8:30, Driscoll's attorney issued a brief statement declining to comment on pending motions. Nora was on the unit at Red Haven when Vasquez called with the update. Standing near the nursing station with a medication cart and a patient chart open on the terminal. Judge Marlowe's clerk called our office, Vasquez said. She's scheduling an emergency hearing for tomorrow. Both the forgery motion and the classification exclusion on the photograph will be heard together. Same judge? Same judge. She consolidated them, which is actually good for us. It means she's looking at the full picture rather than each piece in isolation. Nora made a note in the chart. What's the read? Marlowe has a reputation for being impatient with procedural games. The classification argument was already thin. The photograph doesn't capture classified intelligence. It captures a criminal transaction that happened to occur in proximity to a classified operation. And the forgery motion puts Driscoll's legal team in the position of either defending a document that we've shown to be fraudulent or distancing themselves from it, which amounts to abandoning one of their core strategies. A pause. I'm cautiously optimistic. You're never cautiously optimistic, Nora said. I'm cautiously optimistic today, Vasquez said. Don't make it weird. Dead. Gerald Paxton was located in Scottsdale, Arizona, 4 hours after Farr started looking. He was 63, retired, living on a pension and apparently a supplemental income that had started appearing in his accounts roughly 3 years and 4 months ago, shortly after the Delaware incorporation documents had been filed. The supplemental income came from a consulting contract with a firm that Farr identified in 2 hours as a subsidiary entity 2 layers removed from Meridian Capital Group. Paxton had sold the address, not knowing exactly what it would be used for, possibly, or knowing and deciding the money was worth it. Either way, the trail was clean and documentable, and Reed's team moved on it the same afternoon. Paxton cooperated within 48 minutes of the FBI knocking on his door in Scottsdale, which was the behavior of someone who had been nervous about a decision for 3 years and experienced arrest as a kind of relief from the tension of waiting. His statement identified Carr as the contact who had approached him, which added another documented link in the chain from Driscoll to the forgery to the attempt to frame Nora. Farr called her with this at 2 in the afternoon while she was eating a late lunch in the break room. Paxton, she said. I didn't know him well. He was administrative. He says he didn't know your name was going to be used. He thought he was selling housing data for a background check. Farr paused. He might even believe that. He sold a classified address for money, Nora said. Whatever he believed is secondary. Yes, Farr said, without argument. Farr, she said, when this is over, when the testimony is done, and the hearings are done and it's fully in the record, what happens to the Phantom Unit's history? A pause. The operational details stay classified, he said. That won't change. But the unit's existence, the personnel roster, the mission designation, those can be formally acknowledged through the Senate committee process. Another pause. Harwick wants to push for a formal recognition, not public in the medal ceremony sense, more like an official amendment to the record. The unit existed. The unit served. The unit was erased without cause. Nora thought about the 11 links. Teal and Costas, she said. They're records. Part of the recognition would include a posthumous amendment to their service records, acknowledging the operations they were involved in, and the circumstances of their deaths would be formally reopened. His voice was careful, not quite neutral. It won't bring them back, but their families would know what they actually did. She looked at the break room wall. Someone had pinned up a birthday card for the night shift charge nurse, signed by half the unit in various colors of pen. It matters, she said. Yes, Farr said. It does. The hearing was at 10 the following morning in a federal courthouse in Billings that had marble floors and fluorescent lights, and the particular quality of a space where institutional weight accumulated in the walls over time. Nora was there with Vasquez. Farr was in the gallery. Reed sat at the government's table. Driscoll was present with two attorneys, his face carrying the expression she had never seen on it before. Not fear exactly, but a diminishment, a contraction of the certainty that had been built into his posture the way load-bearing walls were built into a structure. He looked older than the photographs. Judge Marlowe was compact and deliberate and gave both sides exactly the time they needed and not a minute more. She asked the kind of questions that cut straight to the evidentiary center of each argument, and she listened to the answers without the performance of consideration. She was genuinely processing, which was rarer than it should have been. The classification argument took 40 minutes. Marlowe asked Driscoll's attorney 3 specific questions about the nature of classified protection and whether it extended to criminal activity conducted in proximity to a protected operation. And the attorney's answers became progressively more technical and less coherent until Marlowe put up a hand and said, "I've heard enough on this point." She ruled against the exclusion. The photograph was admissible. The forgery motion took 25 minutes. The signature analysis was presented. The notary commission records were entered. Paxton's statement was referenced. Driscoll's attorneys offered a response that contained the phrase, "alternative authentication methodology," and Marlowe looked at them over her glasses with an expression that communicated her assessment without requiring words. She ruled the incorporation documents fraudulent and inadmissible. She also ordered a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office for obstruction of justice charges related to the forgery and the framing attempt. Driscoll sat very still through both rulings. On the way out of the courthouse, one of his attorneys stopped to speak with Reed in a brief exchange that Nora couldn't hear, but Vasquez, who was 2 steps closer, summarized afterward. "They're discussing cooperation," Vasquez said. They were on the courthouse steps in the October air, cold and clear. Driscoll's attorneys are asking about terms. "He wants a deal," Nora said. "He wants to control the damage. He's probably known since the photograph surfaced that the financial case was going to hold. The frame was his last option, and it didn't work." Vasquez looked at her steadily. "He may get something. That's the reality of federal prosecution. The bigger the network, the more useful the person at the top is as a cooperative witness against people above him." Nora looked at the street. A bus passed. An ordinary Wednesday morning in a mid-sized city, people going wherever they were going. "Is there someone above him?" she said. "Possibly." "That's what Reed is trying to find out." Vasquez paused. "It doesn't change your position. Whatever deal Driscoll negotiates, the core charges stand. The financial crimes, the obstruction, the unauthorized record access, none of that gets traded away. The cooperation, if it happens, would be about identifying the larger structure." "Teal and Costas," Nora said. "Will there be charges for what happened to them?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "The investigations were reopened this week. Teal's and Costas's both. Based on the contractor connections to Carr, there's a viable path to charges." She paused carefully. "I won't promise you it gets there, but it's been opened and it will be pursued." That was the most honest thing she could have said, and Nora held on to it. Birch resigned from Red Haven General 5 days after the hearing. The board's statement was brief and institutional, expressing gratitude for his service and wishing him well, which was the language boards used when they needed someone gone and didn't want to say the specific reasons in writing. The hospital retained independent legal counsel to cooperate with the federal investigation and issued a separate statement committing to a full review of the administrative decisions made during the past 2 years. Nora read the statement in the break room between patients. Ruth slid a copy across the nursing station counter to her without comment, which was its own kind of statement. The restructuring plan was formally suspended pending the legal review. The trauma unit remained intact. The 2 residents kept orienting. The ward continued to function the way it had always functioned, imperfectly, under pressure, dependent on people who showed up and did the work with the knowledge that the work was its own reason. 2 weeks after the hearing, Nora received a certified letter from the hospital's new interim administrative director confirming her reinstatement to full active status, retroactive to the date of the attempted suspension. The letter included language that had clearly been written by a lawyer, careful, formal, covering every relevant provision of employment protection law. But at the bottom, in slightly different typeface that suggested it had been added as an afterthought, or a decision made after the official language was drafted, was a single sentence. The hospital's leadership acknowledges that Ms. Callahan's clinical judgment and institutional commitment represent exactly the standard of care Red Haven General aspires to uphold. She folded the letter and put it in her bag. Not because it didn't matter, because it did, and she wasn't ready to leave it somewhere it might get bent. She drove to Carson City on a Thursday in early November. 8 hours, mostly interstate, the kind of drive that was long enough to think without the thinking becoming circular. She stopped twice, ate a sandwich in the car, listened to nothing for most of it because the silence felt productive in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to use silence as a tool. The VA facility outside of Carson City was low and beige and surrounded by scrubby high desert vegetation that looked like it survived through stubbornness rather than water. She checked in at the front desk, gave her name, waited in a room with plastic chairs and a coffee machine that probably worked, and an old television showing a local news program with the sound off. Elio Vargas came through the door 6 minutes later. He was 31 and thin in the way that spoke to years rather than acute illness. The kind of thin that settled in when a body had been running on irregular sleep and irregular meals, and the persistent low-grade metabolic cost of managing what his mind held. He was taller than she remembered, which was strange because she'd seen him at 24 and he should have stopped growing by then, but memory was unreliable that way with people you'd last known under extraordinary conditions. He had the scar on his chin, still there. He stopped when he saw her. She stood. They looked at each other across the width of the waiting room, and there was a specific quality to the moment that she wouldn't have been able to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't had a version of it. The particular weight of recognition between people who had shared something extreme and then spent years carrying it separately. "You look terrible," he said. "So do you," she said. He sat down in the chair next to hers instead of across from her, which she understood was easier, parallel, not face to face. "I heard about the hearing," he said. "It went through. And Driscoll. Formal charges. He's cooperating now, giving up the layer above him." She paused. Teal and Costas. The investigations were reopened. He was quiet for a moment. "Will it go anywhere?" he said. "I think so. I'm not going to promise." He nodded. He had a paper coffee cup in his hands and he was turning it slowly, which was not folding paper but was close. "When they came to ask me questions," he said, "the men from Carr's group, they sat across from me and asked me about you in this very specific way, like they expected me to be afraid of them." He paused. And I was. I was genuinely scared, but I kept thinking. He stopped, restarted. I kept thinking, Callahan is going to fix this, and that was either the most irrational thought I'd had in years, or it was the one true thing I knew. She looked at the television across the room. The news program was showing weather maps. "I almost didn't," she said. "Fix it. I almost put the drive in a drawer and went back to my unit and let it stay buried." "What stopped you?" She thought about Costas, about the 11 links, about her father at 9 years old, a compass in his hand, saying, "You should always be able to find your own way home." "I couldn't stop seeing their faces," she said. "Teal, Costas, you, when you were 24 and still intact." A pause. "Some things you carry until you can put them down in the right place. The drive was one of those things." He was quiet for a long moment. "What happens now?" he said. "For you, Senate testimony in February. The formal record amendment when Harwick's committee completes its review." She paused. "And I go back to work. That's actually what happens next. I have a shift on Saturday." He looked at her. "That's it?" "That's enough," she said. He thought about that. "I want to testify," he said. "If the committee needs field confirmation, I want to be on the record." "I know," she said. "Vasquez already has your name on the witness list. You had a standing there regardless." She paused. "But I wanted to hear you say it." A small sound came from him that might have been a laugh in a different room under different conditions. They sat for a while after that without speaking, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had already said the hard things and were now just being in the same space, which was its own form of transaction between people who'd been in the same dark. When she left, they shook hands in the way she'd shaken hands with her father, thumb over thumb, the lock-click grip that wasn't a hug but meant the same thing. "Come back," he said. "I will," she said. She drove home in the dark. The Senate testimony was in February. The hearing room was formal and lit with the particular intensity of spaces that expected to be on camera, and there were more people present than Nora had been prepared for. Not just the committee members, but staff, observers, journalists in the gallery, and in the back row. Two people she recognized as the adult children of Marcus Teal, who had been notified of the hearing and had come without being asked. She wore her scrubs, not as a statement. She'd had the committee advance staff look at her with the uncertain expression of people trying to diplomatically suggest she might consider something else. And she'd said plainly that she was a trauma nurse and this was what she wore to work, and she didn't see why this should be different. Nobody pushed back. Senator Harwick opened the session with a statement that was careful and precise, outlining the scope of the committee's inquiry without overpromising its conclusions. She was good at this, at setting a frame that was big enough to hold the truth without distorting it. Then Nora spoke. She had prepared a formal statement, and she delivered it in the flat, ordered way she did everything that required precision: dates, coordinates, observations, the chain of custody of the documentation, the specific things she had seen in the field that she had not understood at the time and had come to understand over the following years. She spoke about Teal and Costas by name, not as casualties or statistics, but as people who had done specific things in specific places and whose deaths had been made to look like accidents by people who needed their silence. She spoke for 41 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms went quiet when the thing that had been said was the kind of thing that didn't resolve into simple responses. Harwick asked 3 questions. They were precise and gave Nora the opportunity to clarify 2 points in the record that she had been concerned about, which told her that Harwick had read the testimony carefully and understood which threads needed reinforcement. Then another committee member, an older senator from the Southwest who had a military background and had said almost nothing during the hearing, leaned forward and said, in a voice that carried the particular roughness of a man who had not expected to be affected by what he heard, and was, "Ms. Callahan, you carried that documentation for 6 years. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" She had thought about how to answer this. "Because I didn't trust the system that had erased us," she said. "I needed to know that what I was carrying had somewhere safe to land. It took 6 years to find that." She paused. "I don't regret the timing. I regret that 2 people from my unit died before I got there." The senator sat back. Nobody had a follow-up to that. In March, the Senate Armed Services Committee issued a formal amendment to the official military record acknowledging the existence of the Phantom Unit, its operational history, and the names of all 11 personnel who had served in it. Marcus Teal and Adriani Costas were listed with a notation beside their names: service record amended, operations acknowledged, deaths under investigation. The document was classified at a level that meant most of it wouldn't be public for 30 years. But it existed. It was in the record. A federal archivist had received it, stamped it, filed it in a repository where it would remain regardless of who was in office or what anyone needed it not to say. Nora received a copy through Vasquez. She read it once, alone, at her kitchen table in the early morning before a shift. 11 names, including hers, including Vargas's, including the 2 who were gone. They were in the record now. They had always been real, but now they were documented, and those were different things in a world where what wasn't documented could be made to disappear. She folded the copy and put it in the drawer where she kept her father's unit patch and the coin from Missoula. Driscoll pled guilty in April to 4 federal counts: misappropriation of classified program funds, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud, and 1 count related to the unauthorized use of protected service records. He received 12 years. His cooperation had, as Vasquez predicted, reduced the sentence from what the prosecution had sought. But the count stood, the record stood, and the names of the people he'd tried to bury stood. Carr took a plea on 3 counts, 8 years. Birch was charged with 2 counts of conspiracy related to the acquisition scheme and 1 count of obstruction. His trial was scheduled for the fall. Hale, Marcus Hale, who had sat in seat 1C and laughed in a cabin full of people about how a nurse could afford a first-class ticket, cooperated early and aggressively, and received a reduced sentence and a fine that his attorney described as significant and that his net worth made survivable. He would not go to prison. That was the part of it that was not satisfying. But his cooperation had supplied the evidence that pushed the charges against Driscoll and Carr from negotiable to not. And his financial records had allowed Reed's team to trace the acquisition network fully enough to initiate 3 additional investigations in other states. The law was imperfect, and prosecutorial deals were imperfect, and justice as a concept was imperfect. It arrived in pieces and at uneven rates, and sometimes the wrong person got the lighter end of it. She knew that. She had always known that. What she also knew was that the system hadn't erased her. It had tried, carefully and with some sophistication, and it had failed. And the people who had tried were now in federal records as people who had tried and failed, which was its own form of permanence. On a Tuesday in May, Nora was in Bay 3 with a 67-year-old man named Bernard, who had come in with what his wife described as a funny feeling and turned out to be a STEMI, a full blockage, the kind that moved fast. And she had gotten the 12 lead done and flagged it and called the cath lab before the attending had finished his initial assessment. Afterward, when Bernard was stable and the cath team had cleared the blockage, and he was resting with the particular floaty calm of someone whose body had been to the edge and come back from it, Bernard's wife came to find Nora at the nursing station. She was in her mid-60s, small, with the eyes of someone who had been frightened and was now operating on the particular fuel of gratitude that has nowhere adequate to go. "Thank you," she said. "The doctor said if you hadn't caught it when you did." "We caught it," Nora said. "That's what matters." The woman looked at her for a moment. "You're very calm," she said. "It's a calm kind of work," Nora said, which wasn't entirely true but was the right answer for the woman standing in front of her. The woman went back to her husband. Myers appeared at Nora's elbow. He had been in the room for the STEMI management and had moved cleanly and correctly through every decision point, which was what he did now, more consistently than before, with a precision that had a slightly different quality to it, a fraction more awareness of the people working alongside him rather than simply the problem in front of him. People didn't transform. That was one of the things she'd learned. They adjusted, incrementally, under the right pressure, and sometimes the adjustments accumulated into something that looked like a different person, but was actually just the same person finally taking up the space their better instincts had always been pointing toward. "Good catch," he said. "It was straightforward," she said. He looked at her sideways. "It wasn't straightforward." "No," she said, "but it will be, with practice." He made a sound that conceded the point and went back to his chart. There's a thing that happens to people who have been quietly excellent in difficult conditions for a long time and have been either overlooked or actively diminished for it. They sometimes mistake the world's failure to see them for evidence that there is nothing to see. Nora Callahan had not entirely avoided this mistake. She had told herself on more days than she would have admitted that the quietness of her life was a choice rather than a circumstance, that she preferred to move through the world without drawing attention, that the recognition she didn't receive was recognition she didn't need. Some of that was true. She did prefer to work without performance, to be competent without announcement, to stand in a crisis and know what to do without needing anyone to confirm that she knew it. But some of it was something else. The accumulated weight of being told, in 100 small and large ways, in plane cabins, in hospital corridors, in the structures of institutions that had used her and then attempted to discard her, that what she was and what she had done was unremarkable, inconvenient, or worse, a liability. What the last several months had done was not transform her into someone different. It had simply provided the record, the external document of what had always been internally true, that she had seen what others missed, that she had carried what others dropped, that the 11 links on her arm were not a memorial, but a commitment, a refusal to let people be made into nothing by the convenience of those who needed them silent. She had been dismissed on a plane. She had been handed a suspension notice in front of colleagues she'd worked alongside for 4 years. She had been framed by people who understood how institutional power worked as the villain of a story they'd written specifically to survive her testimony. And she had stood in the middle of all of it and done her work. That was not smooth. That was not perfect. She had been tired and frightened and wrong about the timing on at least 2 decisions, and she had eaten a 2-week expired granola bar in a hospital break room during a federal investigation, and she had slept in 3 different motels in 10 days and cried exactly once, briefly, in the parking lot of a public library in Billings while Vasquez and Farr were building the filing inside a rental car because her father was newly buried and she was alone in a way she didn't have the language for. But she had done her work. There was a lesson in that, though she would have resisted the word lesson because it suggested a neater narrative than the actual experience contained. More accurately, there was something she understood now that she hadn't before, or that she'd known abstractly and now knew in her body. Strength that other people couldn't see doesn't stop being strength. The things you've carried in silence don't become less real because no one witnessed you carrying them. And the people who dismissed you, in planes, in boardrooms, in classified programs that erased your name from the record, were not evaluating you accurately. They were evaluating their own comfort level with what you represented, which was something they couldn't control and therefore needed to diminish. The diminishment never touched the actual thing. On a Friday evening in June, she drove to the cemetery in Billings where her father was buried. She hadn't been back since the funeral. She'd been meaning to go and had found, each time she prepared to, a reason not to. Another shift, another piece of paperwork, another patient who needed something she could provide. She understood on the drive there that the reasons had been real but also a form of postponement, and she had postponed enough things and it was time to stop. The cemetery was quiet in the early evening. The light was long and gold, the way it got in Montana in June. Not quite warm, not quite cool, suspended in a kind of perfect indecision between the seasons. She found the plot without needing the map she'd made at the funeral. She'd known she'd find it. She stood there for a while, not long enough to require words, long enough to be present, which was what she'd always been best at. Presence in the specific sense of not retreating, not managing from a distance, not processing through the glass of detachment. She thought about what he would have said about the last 8 months. Not about the Senate's testimony or the federal case or the vindication of the unit's record. He wouldn't have been interested in those things first. He would have wanted to know, did you sleep enough? Are you eating? Are you still doing work that matters? She was. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the coin from Missoula, the one she'd carried since she was 22, when she first left home, and he'd pressed it into her hand at the airport without ceremony and said, "So you know where you came from." She turned it over once, put it back, took out his unit patch instead, the one she'd taken from his dresser after the funeral. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it carefully at the base of the headstone, held down by a small stone she picked up from beside the path, and took a step back. "I found my way home," she said. The light didn't change. The evening didn't respond. There was only the ordinary silence of a summer evening and the distant sound of a car on the road beyond the cemetery gates. But she had said it, and it was true. And truth didn't require a witness to be real. She drove back to Red Haven with the window open and the warm June air moving through the car. And somewhere in the high clear sky above the valley, the day was finishing itself without drama, the way good days did. Not with a conclusion, but with a continuation, a quiet rolling forward into whatever came next. She had a shift in the morning. She was ready.